cold stone against his cheek, the smell of sulfur and something rotten. Ethan opened his eyes and saw a ceiling made of rough-hewn stone. He was lying on the floor in a small room. Nearby stood a copper cauldron over an open fire. The flames licked the bottom of the cauldron and cast reddish shadows on the walls. Thick, brown steam rose from the cauldron. Ethan sat up and hit the back of his head against the edge of a wooden table. The pain was real, too real. He drew in a breath through his nose and identified the smell. Not cadaveric poison, spoiled salamander blood. He would recognize that distinctive, sweetish rotten scent anywhere. But how did he know the smell of salamander blood? He was a chemist from Boston. He'd worked in a pharmaceutical lab. He'd fallen asleep during his third night shift. There had been a reaction with diethyl ether. The fume hood had been faulty. There had been an explosion. Ethan looked at his hands. They were not his own. Thin, pale. The fingers were long and weak. On his right palm was an acid burn, an old one. It had healed unevenly. He stood up. His legs were shaking. His body felt light and fragile. He walked over to the copper cauldron and peered inside. A murky brown sludge bubbled at the bottom. He leaned in closer and inhaled the steam. Organic compounds, plant alkaloids, something mineral-like, and one more note, strange, pure, unlike anything else, as if an ingredient that doesn't exist in nature were floating in this brew. Ethan stepped back from the cauldron and surveyed the room. Stone walls, shelves running along the walls. Dozens of glass and clay vessels stood on the shelves. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Scrolls lay in stacks on the table next to a quill and an inkwell, an open flame, indoors, with volatile chemicals on the shelves. Ethan automatically noted 3 safety violations. Then he remembered that he didn't know where he was or what kind of room this was. He picked up the nearest scroll and unrolled it. The text was handwritten in a language he didn't know, but he understood it. Every word sank into his mind as if it were his own. Add 3 pinches of moonflower pollen during a full moon. Place stir clockwise. Whisper the name of the first teacher. Ethan read it twice. Then he put the scroll back. He walked over to the shelf and took the first vial he came across. The label was written in scrawled handwriting. Moonflower pollen. Variety undetermined. Purity not specified. He opened the vial and sniffed. He grimaced. It wasn't pure pollen. It was mold with traces of pollen, about 15% of the target substance. The rest was junk. He put the vial back and looked at the cauldron, then at the scrolls, then at his own unfamiliar hands. Whoever the previous owner of this body had been, the guy had been brewing poison, not out of malice, out of ignorance. Ethan sat down on the edge of the table and tried to think. The facts were simple. He had died. He had woken up in a stranger's body. The body belonged to someone who worked with chemicals. The world around him was unlike anything from his former life. The Middle Ages, stone, fire, scrolls instead of textbooks, and recipes that referenced the lunar cycle instead of molar mass. Ethan rubbed his face with his palms. His palms smelled of sulfur. All right, he doesn't know what happened. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know who he is now. But he knows one thing. Whoever was brewing in that cauldron was doing it wrong. And if this world runs on reagents and recipes, then it needs a chemist. He started by taking inventory. He took every vial off the shelf, opened it, sniffed it. He checked them against the light. He touched them with his finger and rubbed them between his fingertips. Of the 42 vials, only 7 contained anything usable. The rest were expired, contaminated, improperly dried, or had been prepared incorrectly from the start. Ethan found a stack of notebooks on the table. The handwriting was clumsy and hurried, the same as on the labels, so it must have been written by the body's former owner. Ethan flipped through the pages and pieced together the story. His name was Ethan Crow. At first, the coincidence of the name frightened him. Then it seemed absurd. Then he simply accepted it. This Ethan Crow was a 17-year-old orphan from a fishing village, a scholarship student at Valemore Academy, last in his class 3 years in a row, the weakest magical reserve in his class, the butt of everyone's jokes, a punching bag. The record showed that a week ago, this Ethan had drunk a potion of his own making. He'd been trying to boost his reserves. Judging by the recipe Ethan found on a separate sheet of paper, the boy had mixed a monostimulant with an unpurified extract from the root of the silverweed. No buffer, no dosage control over the dosage, without the slightest understanding of what he was doing. The result was predictable. The body's former owner died, and the body went to a chemist from Boston. Ethan closed the notebook. He sat there for a minute. Then he stood up and began cleaning up the lab. By morning, he had the room in relative order. He threw out everything unusable, wiped down the shelves, sorted the remaining 7 working reagents by volatility, found a copper basin under the table, washed it, adapted it to serve as a condensate collector, found a piece of thick fabric, folded it into several layers. The result was a primitive filter, not perfect, but it would do for a start. He lay down on the narrow bed in the corner of the room. The bed creaked and smelled musty. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep in 30 seconds. He was awakened by a knock on the door. The knocking was loud and persistent. Ethan sat up. It was light outside the window. He'd slept for about 3 hours. The knocking repeated. Ethan got up and opened the door. A girl was standing there. She was short, with dark, shoulder-length hair and Asian features. She was holding a stack of books and looked at him with cautious surprise. She said class started in half an hour and asked if he was all right. She said she'd heard a noise coming from his room 3 days ago. Then it had gone quiet. She'd been knocking. No one answered. She thought he had left. Ethan looked at her. 3 days. So the body had been lying on the floor for 3 days. He replied that he'd been sick, but he was feeling better now. She nodded. She introduced herself. Minju So, a neighbor on the same floor. School of Healing Arts. She said there was an alchemy lecture today with Professor Halbrandt and asked if he would go. Ethan asked what kind of lecture it was. Minju explained. A practical session. The minor restoration potion. A standard third-year topic. Ethan said he'd go. Minju smiled slightly. It looked like a sigh of relief. She left. Ethan closed the door. He looked at himself in the cloudy mirror on the wall. A gaunt face. Dark circles under his eyes. His hair was dirty and tangled. He was 17 in this body. He felt every one of his 28 years. He washed his face with cold water from a pitcher. He put on the robe hanging on a hook by the door. The robe was gray and worn. The other students' robes were dark blue with silver trim. A gray robe without trim meant he was a scholarship student. Ethan stepped out into the hallway. Valemore Academy turned out to be enormous. Stone hallways stretched off in every direction. Stained glass windows cast colorful patches of light onto the floor. Students walked in groups. They laughed. They talked. They carried books and scrolls. Ethan followed Minju, memorizing the route. She moved quickly and silently. As they passed a group of students in expensive robes, one of them called out to Ethan. Tall, fair-haired, sharp features, expensive fabric, a silver griffin clasp on his collar. He said he was surprised to see a mana cripple on his feet. He said he thought the guy had finally drunk something useful, something that wouldn't make him wake up. His friends laughed. Ethan looked at him. His body's memory didn't suggest a name. But the notebooks of his former host mentioned the name Julian, the heir to the Count's house, the main source of trouble. Ethan didn't answer. He just walked past. Julian called out something else after him. Ethan didn't turn around. Minju was walking beside him. She wasn't looking in Julian's direction, but Ethan noticed how she clutched her books tighter. She was used to this. They were both used to it. The old Ethan was used to it. The new Ethan wasn't yet. The lecture hall was large and semicircular. Rows of stone benches sloped down to a central area where stood a long table with cauldrons. Professor Halbrandt was already there, a large man with a thick gray beard and hands covered in old burn scars. He stood behind the central cauldron, arranging the ingredients. The students took their seats. Ethan sat in the back row. Minju sat 2 rows below him. She turned around and gave him a brief nod. The professor began his lecture. He spoke about the minor restoration potion, a standard recipe. It had been in use for 3 centuries. It heals half of a minor wound. Side effect, drowsiness for up to 3 hours. Bitter taste, cloudy consistency. That's normal. It's always been that way. That's how it's supposed to be. Ethan listened, and with every sentence the professor spoke, he understood more and more. The recipe was ineffective, not because it was bad, but because it had never been optimized. The dried silverweed root was added whole, without any preliminary processing, and that meant tannins got into the potion. They caused the bitterness, and saponins, they caused the cloudiness, and the alkaloid from the root bark, it caused drowsiness. 3 side effects, 3 unnecessary components, and all 3 could be eliminated with one simple step, rinsing in acidified water. The professor handed out the ingredients. Each student received a portion for 1 cauldron. Ethan got his and carried it to the far cauldron by the wall. He laid out the ingredients on the table. He looked at them. Silverweed root, dirty, with bits of soil still clinging to it. Moon moss powder, caked together, clumpy. Water from the academy well, slightly cloudy. Ethan sighed. Then he got to work. He asked his table-mate for a clay cup. He poured water into it. He found a bottle of vinegar on the shelf. The academy used it to clean boilers. Ethan added vinegar to the water. He ended up with a weak, acidic solution. He placed the silverweed root in it. He waited 5 minutes. He took it out. The root had lightened in color. The tannins had dissolved into the solution. Ethan sliced the root into thin strips. Here, everyone just threw it in whole. This increased the surface area for contact. Basic chemistry. He loaded the ingredients into the cauldron, but he didn't bring it to a boil. He kept the temperature lower. Slow heating. No violent boiling. Boiling destroyed some of the active compounds. That was obvious too, to a chemist. While the potion was heating up, Ethan took out the cloth he'd prepared that morning. He folded it into several layers. Between the layers, he placed crushed charcoal from the stove. The result was a charcoal filter. Primitive, but it worked. When the decoction was ready, he passed it through the filter. A murky brown liquid passed through the cloth and charcoal. A clear golden liquid emerged from the filter. Ethan looked at the result. He held it up to the light. Clear, transparent, no cloudiness, no sediment. He sniffed it. The bitterness was gone. A mild, grassy scent remained. He poured the potion into a glass and walked over to Professor Halbrandt. Several students were already standing around the central table with their results. Murky brown liquids in bulbous beakers. Standard stuff. Ethan set his vial on the table. The golden, clear liquid glinted softly in the light streaming through the stained glass window. Professor Halbrandt fell silent mid-sentence. He took the vial, brought it up to his eyes. He turned it this way and that. He looked at the light. He opened it and sniffed. His expression changed. First, bewilderment, then surprise, then something akin to shock. He said it smelled like the descriptions from the lost texts of the First Age. He asked where Ethan had gotten it. Ethan replied that he'd brewed it. According to the professor's recipe, he'd simply removed the impurities. The lecture hall fell silent. The students looked at the cloudy vials in their hands, then at the golden vial on the table, then at Ethan in his gray, worn robe without a trim. Julian Ashford stood in the third row. His face was frozen. In the front row sat a girl with fiery red hair. The silver clasp on her robe was the same as Julian's, a griffin, the Ashford family crest. She was looking at Ethan, not with contempt, not with pity, with a question. Professor Halbrandt set the vial on the table and was silent for a long time. Then he said the class was over, and he asked Ethan to stay behind. The two of them remained alone in the empty hall. Halbrandt sat at the table, holding the vial in front of him. He asked what Ethan had done with the recipe. Ethan explained. 3 steps. Rinsing the root in an acidic solution, filtering through charcoal, slow heating instead of boiling. Halbrandt listened. His thick eyebrows rose higher and higher. He asked how Ethan knew this. Ethan replied that he'd figured it out. Halbrandt was silent for a moment. Then he said that in 30 years of teaching, not a single student had ever thought of such a thing. He said the potion needed to be tested. He made a shallow cut on his forearm. He took a sip. The cut healed in a minute. A standard potion would have taken 5 minutes for the same wound, and Halbrandt didn't feel drowsy. He looked at Ethan with new eyes. He said that this changed a lot. Then his expression darkened, and he added that it wasn't something to talk about openly. There are people who won't like the fact that a scholarship student with no reserves makes potions better than the guild's masters. Ethan nodded. He understood the warning. In this world, knowledge was currency, and new knowledge was a threat to those who traded in the old. Ethan returned to his room. He sat down on the bed. He looked at the cauldron, at the shelves, at the window beyond which the towers of the academy were visible. He didn't know how he'd ended up here. He didn't know if he could go back. He didn't know what had happened to the body's former owner, but he knew one thing. In this world, there was chemistry. Strange, with an incomprehensible variable in the form of mana, but chemistry nonetheless, and that meant it could be understood, improved, systematized. Ethan lay down on the bed. The ceiling above him was made of dark stone. Somewhere, water was dripping somewhere behind the wall. He closed his eyes and thought that tomorrow he needed to find some decent glass user, and something for distillation, and an acid stronger than table vinegar. He fell asleep. Ethan spent the next 3 days gathering intelligence. He attended lectures, sat in the back row, listened. He took notes, not his own notes on magic, but observations of the system, how the academy was organized, who was in charge, who was dangerous, where the ingredients were stored, and where he could get glass and copper. Valemore Academy was the 3rd most prestigious of the 7 great academies, but it was the most conservative. Here, they didn't just follow ancient recipes. Here, they considered them sacred. Deviating from a recipe was equated with heresy, not metaphorically, literally. The Church of the Primordial Light, which oversaw all the academies, had the right to send a heretic to the Inquisition for trial. The Inquisition in this world did not burn people at the stake. It stripped them of their mana, which, for a mage, was worse than death. Ethan noted this in his new journal. He'd started it on his very first day, a plain notebook stolen from the Academy's storeroom. He wrote everything down. Temperatures, observations, results, hypotheses. No one else here did that. Students memorized recipes by heart and repeated them word for word. Professors graded them on the accuracy of their repetition, not the result. Accuracy. If a potion turned out cloudy but was brewed according to the recipe, it was considered a success. If a potion turned out clear but the recipe had been altered, it was considered a violation. Ethan figured out the system in 2 days, and he realized it was broken. His main problem was money, or rather, the lack of it. Ethan's scholarship here amounted to 30 copper coins a month. That was just enough for food, barely. Ingredients cost silver. Glassware cost silver. Any tool more sophisticated than a wooden spoon cost silver. Ethan didn't have a single silver coin. He began looking for other ways. First, he explored the utility rooms in the scholarship students' wing. The east wing of the academy was the oldest and most run down. Scholars lived here because no one else wanted to. The walls were covered in mold. The windows wouldn't close. The roof leaked. But there were advantages to this. There were many abandoned rooms here. In one of them, Ethan found what he was looking for, a former storage room. Small, no windows, but with a stone floor and a high ceiling. Broken shelves stood in the corner. Shards of glassware lay beneath them. Ethan spent 2 hours on his knees. He gathered everything that wasn't completely shattered. 3 flasks with cracks, 1 intact retort, 2 glass rods, a copper tube, bent but intact. He carried it all to his room and set to work. He filled the cracks in the flasks with a mixture of tree resin and ash. It wasn't perfect, but it'll do for low temperatures. He straightened the copper tube. He adapted it to serve as a condenser for the vapors. He connected it to the retort. The result was a primitive distillation apparatus. Ugly, crooked, but functional. Minju stopped by to see him on the evening of the 3rd day. She brought bread and cheese. She said he hadn't been to the dining hall for 2 days. Ethan realized he'd forgotten to eat. He thanked her and took the food. Minju stood in the doorway and looked into his room, at the copper apparatus on the table, at the vials lined up in a row, at the notebook with his notes. She asked what he was doing. Ethan explained that he was setting up a lab. Minju asked why. Ethan replied that he wanted to work properly. Minju was silent for a moment. Then she said that in the 3 years they'd been living on the same floor, he'd never before spoken more than 2 words to her in a row. Ethan didn't bother explaining that he was a different person. He simply said that before, he hadn't had anything to talk about, but now he did. Minju sat down on the only chair. She told him about herself. The School of Healing, Junior. Her mana reserve is above average, but she has a tremor in her hands. It was the result of a childhood trauma. She couldn't draw healing runes with precision, and without that, a healer is useless. She said this calmly, as if stating a fact. But Ethan saw how she clenched her fingers on her knees. She'd been expecting to be expelled every semester for 3 years in a row. Ethan looked at her hands. The tremor was slight, barely noticeable, but for work requiring precision down to a fraction of a millimeter, that's enough to ruin everything. He asked if she'd tried anything. She replied that she'd tried everything. Potions, exercises, meditation, nothing helped. Ethan nodded. He said he'd think about it. Minju looked at him strangely, as if she didn't believe him, but she nodded and left. On the 4th day, the first real skirmish took place. Ethan was returning from the library. He'd spent half the day there, reading everything he could find on alchemy. The local textbooks were unbearable. Half the text consisted of prayers. A quarter consisted of warnings that deviating from the recipe was a sin, and only the remaining quarter contained useful information. But even in that, Ethan found bits and pieces. He learned what mana was, or more precisely, what the locals thought mana was. Energy flowing through the veins of living beings, granted by the gods, unchanging and unknowable. Ethan jotted it down in his journal. Mana, energy, interacts with matter, may act as a catalyst. It may have a physical nature, to be verified. He was walking down the 2nd floor hallway when his path was blocked. Julian Ashford. He was with 2 others. One was broad-shouldered with a dull expression. The other was thin, with long fingers. Julian said he'd heard an interesting story, that Mana, Cripple had brewed some potion, and Professor Halbrand actually got teary-eyed. He said it was very funny. He asked if Ethan could show the trick again, right now. Ethan assessed the situation. The hallway was empty, 3 against 1. His body was weak. He had no magic. Fighting was pointless. There was nowhere to run. He said he didn't understand what they were talking about. Julian took a step closer. He said he didn't like it when dirt pretended to be gold. He said his family donated 2,000 gold pieces a year to the academy, and that scholarship students existed only because the Ashfords paid for their upkeep. Ethan remained silent. Julian grabbed him by the collar of his robe and pinned him against the wall. His fingers were hot. Mana coursed through them. Ethan could feel it, a slight tingling, like static electricity. Julian said that if Ethan tried to stand out one more time, he'd regret it. That a scholarship student could be expelled based on a single complaint from a noble house. Ethan looked him in the eye. Julian expected fear, or anger, or a plea. Ethan gave him none of it. He just looked, calmly, as if watching a reaction in a test tube. This threw Julian off balance. He loosened his grip on Ethan's collar, said something about a pitiful sight, left. His friends followed him. Ethan adjusted his robe, made a note in his journal. Julian Ashford, moderate threat, motivation, status, pride, method. Pressure through administrative channels. Countermeasure. Become too useful to be expelled. Day 5. Second lecture on alchemy. Halbrand led a workshop on the elixir of clarity. Standard recipe. Improves concentration for 2 hours. Side effect. headache, a severe one. That's why students only used it before exams, and then suffered for half the day afterward. Ethan studied the recipe. The problem was the same. Unrefined ingredients, rough processing, lack of temperature control. He worked quietly, in the far corner. No one paid any attention to him. He repeated his 3 basic steps: rinsing, filtering, slow heating, and he added a 4th. While studying books in the library, he found a mention that marsh mint leaves neutralize the alkaloids that cause headaches. The locals used this mint only in cooking. It hadn't occurred to anyone to add it to the potion because it wasn't in the ancient recipe. Ethan added it, 3 leaves, finely chopped, during the slow heating stage. The result? A clear, bluish, odorless liquid. Ethan didn't approach the professor. Instead, he took the vial to his room. That evening, Minju came by, with some bread. Ethan let her try it. He explained that it was a concentration potion, with no side effects. Minju drank it. 10 minutes later, her eyes widened. She said everything had become crystal clear. Her thoughts were racing. Her head was clear, and nothing hurt. She looked at Ethan. She asked how many of these he could make. Ethan said it depended on the ingredients. He had almost nothing left. Minju was silent for a moment. Then she said she knew people who needed this, before their exams, which were in 3 weeks. She said she could sell it. She had contacts in various departments. Quietly, without drawing attention, Ethan thought it over. He needed money, he needed ingredients, he needed equipment, and Minju needed a purpose and the feeling that she was useful. He agreed. They made a deal. Minju would handle sales and logistics. Ethan would brew. They'd split the profits 50-50. Minju held out her hand. Ethan shook it. Her hand trembled slightly, but her grip was firm. The following week, Ethan brewed every evening. Minju brought the ingredients. She bought them with her own money from her scholarship. Ethan tried to object. She said it was an investment. He fell silent. She was right. In 1 week, he brewed 20 vials of clear water. That's what they called the potion. Minju sold the first batch in 3 days, 5 silver coins per vial. A standard clarity potion from the shop cost 7 silver coins and caused headaches. Clear water was cheaper and worked better. Word spread quickly. Within a week, unfamiliar students were approaching Minju. She sold only to those she trusted. She made them promise not to reveal where the potion came from. But secrets didn't last long at the academy. By the end of the 2nd week, Ethan had earned enough to buy decent glass. He found a workshop in a village outside the academy walls, a glass blower, an old man named Grammar. Ethan drew him some blueprints, flasks with measurement markings, a retort with a long neck, and a funnel for filtration. Glass tubes of various diameters. Grammar looked at the blueprints in bewilderment. He asked why there were lines on the flasks. Ethan explained that they were for measuring volume. Grammar scratched his head and said he'd make them for 3 silver coins. Ethan paid him. Toward the end of the 2nd week, Ethan was sorting through the belongings of the body's former owner. He did so methodically. Exams were approaching, and the academy was buzzing like a beehive. Students stayed up all night. They crammed formulas. They reviewing recipes. They downed standard clarity potions and then lay in bed with headaches for 3 hours. Ethan's clear water had become a currency. Minju was selling her last vials for 8 silver coins each. Demand was 4 times the supply. Ethan brewed every night. The new glassware from Grammar had transformed the quality of his work. Measuring flasks allowed for precise dosing of ingredients. A long-necked retort improved distillation. A glass funnel with a charcoal filter sped up filtration. Ethan could feel the difference. It was as if he'd been moved from a garage to a proper laboratory. Not perfect, but the progress was enormous. He earned 40 silver coins in 2 weeks. That was more than Ethan's annual scholarship here. He spent half on ingredients, a quarter on new equipment, and hid the rest. Professor Halbrandt called him in for a talk during the 3rd week. Ethan went to his office, a small room crammed with books, the smell of old parchment and wine. Halbrandt sat at his desk and looked at him over his glasses. He said he'd heard about a potion being sold among the students. He said he'd discovered the recipe. It was his, Ethan's. He wasn't angry. He was intrigued. He asked if Ethan could explain what he was doing. Not what, but why it worked. Ethan sat down across from him. He thought for a moment. Then he began to explain, simply, without using terms from his own world, in a language the professor could understand. He said that every ingredient consists of different parts. Some are beneficial, others are harmful, still others are useless. Ancient recipes use the whole ingredient, with all its parts. It's like eating fish with bones, scales, and guts. You can do it, but it's unappetizing and dangerous. He suggested cleaning the ingredient first, removing the unnecessary parts, keeping only what works. Halbrand listened in silence. Then he asked how Ethan knew which parts were necessary and which weren't. Ethan said he observes, he experiments, he takes notes, he repeats, he changes one thing at a time. He looks at the result. Halbrand leaned forward. His eyes sparkled. He said that sounded reasonable, too reasonable for a boy who had been at the bottom of his class for 3 years. Ethan didn't blink. He said the illness had changed him. When you're lying unconscious for 3 days, you think differently. Halbrand accepted that, not because he believed it, but because he wanted to believe it. He said he wanted a proposal. He was ready to become Ethan's research advisor, officially. This would give Ethan access to the professor's ingredient storeroom, to the closed stack library, and to protection. Because an academic advisor is responsible for a student's work, which meant it would be harder to accuse Ethan of heresy. Ethan accepted the offer without hesitation. They shook hands. Halbrand's hand was rough and strong. Access to the professor's storeroom changed everything. For the first time, Ethan saw ingredients that were worth their weight in gold. Mana crystals. Translucent bluish stones the size of a fingernail. Each was worth 20 gold pieces. They were the foundation of the most powerful potions. Local alchemists ground them into powder and added them to their brews. Ethan picked up one crystal. He held it up to the light. He examined its internal structure, regular geometry, sharp facets. It looked like a mineral crystal, but it felt different. When he held the crystal in his hand, he felt a faint warmth and a tingling sensation, just like with Julian. Mana. Ethan made a note in his journal. Mana crystal, crystalline structure, regular lattice, probably a mineral of unknown composition, emits energy upon contact with living tissue. Hypothesis: mana has a physical nature. It can be extracted, it can be concentrated, to be tested. He began his experiments, in secret, in his storage room laboratory, every evening after dinner. He dissolved tiny fragments of the mana crystal in various media: water, vinegar, alcohol he had distilled from the Academy's wine, oil. The results were astonishing. The crystal did not dissolve in water, nor in vinegar. In alcohol, it slowly lost its luster and became cloudy. It showed no reaction in oil. But when Ethan added the alcohol-based mana solution to a standard restoration potion, something unexpected happened. The potion flared with gold, not fire, light. For 3 seconds, the flask shone so brightly that Ethan recoiled. Then the light faded. The potion in the flask became thick, viscous, dark gold. Ethan cautiously sniffed it. The scent had changed. It had become deeper, more complex. He applied a drop to a small cut on his finger. The cut healed instantly. Not in a minute, not in a second, instantly. The skin became smooth, as if the cut had never been there. Ethan stared at his finger. His heart was pounding. Alcohol. Alcohol was the key. Mana dissolved in alcohol, not in water. For 3 centuries, local alchemists had been using water-based decoctions, and they had been losing most of the crystal's magical potency. Because mana didn't dissolve in water, it remained in the undissolved sediment that was discarded. 3 centuries. Ethan sat down on the floor. He leaned his back against the wall. For 3 centuries, these people had been using the most valuable ingredient in the world with only 10% efficiency, because no one had thought to try a different solvent, because the ancient recipe called for water, and no one asked why. He wrote down the results. He underlined them 3 times. Mana is soluble in ethanol. Water-based extracts are ineffective. All existing water-based recipes operate at 10% of their potential. It was a discovery that could turn the whole world upside down, and that could destroy it. The next day, he told Halbrand, not everything, just the part about solubility. He left out the details of how he'd obtained the alcohol. Distilling wine was technically legal, but could raise questions. Halbrand listened. He was silent for a moment. Then he stood up from the table. He walked over to the cabinet. He took out a bottle of wine, poured himself a full glass, downed it in one gulp, sat back down. He said that if this were true, half of all the recipes in the world would have to be revised. Ethan nodded. Halbrand said they couldn't talk about this, for now. The Alchemists Guild controls the production and sale of mana crystals. If they find out that someone has discovered a way to use the crystals 5 times more effectively, it will crash their market, and the guild doesn't forgive those who crash markets. Ethan understood. It was just like in the pharmaceutical industry. Patents, monopolies. When someone finds a cheap alternative to an expensive drug, the corporation doesn't rejoice for humanity. It destroys the inventor. Halbrand proposed a plan. They would work together, quietly, document everything, prepare a scientific paper. When they had enough data, they would present the results to the Council of Academies, publicly, in front of witnesses, where the guild wouldn't be able to silence them. Ethan agreed. It was a good plan, a long one, but a safe one. That same night, he returned to the book. He sat on the bed and studied the formulas by candlelight. He couldn't read the text, but the formulas spoke a universal language. He recognized the structures, benzene rings, amide bonds, esters. Whoever wrote this book knew organic chemistry at a level no lower than university. In a world without universities, in a world without the periodic table, Ethan found one formula that appeared more often than the others. It was complex, a long chain, several functional groups, and next to it was an arrow pointing to a symbol that appeared throughout the book. The same symbol, repeating, highlighted. Ethan didn't know what it meant, but he sensed it was the key. He copied the symbol into his notebook. Beneath it, he wrote a question. What is this? He closed the notebook, went to bed. He dreamed of formulas. Exams began in 2 days. Ethan was taking them for the first time in this body. The theoretical alchemy exam was first. 200 questions, recipes, ingredients, their properties, their uses. The old Ethan knew the answers to half of them. The new Ethan knew the answers to all of them, not because he'd memorized them, but because he understood. When you're asked which ingredient neutralizes mountain viper venom, you can recall the answer from the textbook, or you can think it through. Mountain viper venom is protein-based. Proteins denature when heated or in an acidic environment. What ingredient creates an acidic environment in the body? White rosehip berries. The answer. Ethan finished the theory exam in 40 minutes, obtaining of the allotted 3 hours. The professor grading the exam looked at him suspiciously. He checked. Not a single mistake. The first time in the history of the course. The news spread quickly. The mana cripple, last in the class for 3 years in a row, passed the theory exam with the highest score. In 40 minutes, Julian Ashford found out about it that same day, and his face turned to stone. The practical exam was in 2 days. The assignment, brew a minor restoration potion. Standard recipe, no deviations. Graded on precision in following the recipe and the quality of the result. Ethan faced a choice. Brew according to the recipe and get a standard murky sludge, or brew it his own way and get a golden potion. The first option was safe. The second was risky. Before the exam, Halbrand approached him and quietly told him not to stand out. Ethan nodded. He stood at the cauldron. He began brewing, according to the recipe, precisely, without deviation. His hands went through the familiar motions. Aiden Willow appeared in his life the day after the exams. Ethan was sitting in the library, copying formulas from a book he'd found into his journal. He'd come early in the morning when the halls were empty. He carried the book with him, under his robe. He didn't trust the lock on his door. He heard footsteps and closed the book. Eden walked over and sat down across from him. No greeting, no preamble. She said she wanted to know how he'd done it. Ethan asked what exactly. She said he'd been the worst in the class for 3 years, and then, in just 1 week, he'd become the best on the theory exam. People don't change like that. Ethan looked at her. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Her back was straight, her sharp gray eyes. Not a trace of makeup. The class president's badge on her gown. She was beautiful, but her beauty was cold, calculated, like a perfectly formatted lab report. He said he'd been sick, and that the illness had forced him to think in a new way. Aiden didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Instead, she asked him a question, a professional one, about the interaction between silverweed root and blue lotus essence. A standard topic for a term paper. Ethan answered, not by the textbook, by logic. He explained that the root contains substances that conflict with the volatile components of the lotus, that a buffer is needed, that if a pinch of Dead Sea salt were added during the mixing stage, the conflict could be eliminated. Aiden listened. Her expression shifted. First skepticism, then interest, then something resembling hunger. She asked how he knew about Dead Sea salt. Ethan said he'd made an assumption, and that it needed to be tested. She said she'd check it out. She stood up. She left. She didn't say goodbye. Ethan went back to his notes. He didn't know yet that he just passed a test. Aiden was testing him, and he'd passed. She returned 3 days later, with the results. The Dead Sea salt worked. The root and the lotus were no longer conflicting. The potion, which had previously required 2 days of steeping, was ready in 6 hours. Aiden placed a notebook with her notes in front of him. Neat handwriting, hand-drawn graphs, precise measurements. She had been keeping a journal. The only other person besides him at this academy. Ethan looked at the notes, then at her. He said it was good work. Aiden flinched slightly. She wasn't used to being praised for the process. She was praised for the result, for her grades, for coming in first. No one had ever told her that the work itself was good. She sat down, and they began to talk, for real, for 2 hours, about the reagents, about methods, about why ancient recipes aren't optimized. Aiden spoke quickly, precisely. She knew every recipe in the program by heart, all 312 of them. Ethan didn't know a single one by heart, but he understood the principles behind each one. They complemented each other, like a reference guide and an analyst. Aiden sensed that too. As she was leaving, she said she'd come back tomorrow if he didn't mind. Ethan said he didn't mind. At the same time, he was working on a project for Minju, Tremor. He thought about it every evening. Minju would come to see him before bedtime. She'd bring him food. She'd sit on a chair, in silence. Sometimes she'd talk about her day. Ethan listened and worked. He studied the tremor. Local medicine considered it a curse, or a punishment for the sins of ancestors. Ethan considered it a neurological disorder. The muscles in the fingers were receiving incorrect signals, too frequent, too strong. Ethan couldn't cure it. He didn't have the tools. He lacked the knowledge of a neurologist, but he could compensate for that. He remembered tactile stabilizers. In his world, there were hand weights, gloves with lead inserts. They mechanically dampened the tremor. The weight suppressed the micro movements, but there were no lead inserts here. Instead, there was mana. Ethan thought about it for 3 days. Then he found a solution: thimbles. Copper thimbles for each finger. Inside each thimble was a thin layer of ointment, an ointment made from ice moss extract, a plant the locals used for pain relief. But at low concentrations, it didn't numb the pain. It slightly slowed nerve impulses, just enough to dampen the excess signals, but not enough to cause numbness. Ethan calculated the dosage. It took a week. He made samples with varying concentrations, tested them on himself, and recorded his sensations. Too much, his fingers go numb. Too little, no effect. He found the balance on the 6th sample, a slight slowing. His fingers move freely, but the micro-tremor subsides. He ordered thimbles from the blacksmith in the village, 10 of them, thin, lightweight, made to fit Minju's fingers. He measured her fingers while she slept in a chair in his lab. She often fell asleep there, exhausted after class. The thimbles were ready in 4 days. Ethan applied the ointment to the inside. He tested it on himself one more time. It worked. That evening, he called for Minju. She came in. He placed the thimbles on the table. 10 small copper rings. Shiny, neat. Minju looked at them, puzzled. Ethan explained. Put them on. Try drawing a rune. Minju put on the thimbles, slowly, one on each finger. Ethan handed her a quill and a sheet of paper. She took the quill. Her hand trembled as usual, and then it stopped. Minju froze. She looked at her hand. Her fingers were still, completely still. For the first time in 12 years, she raised the quill. She began to draw. The line was smooth, straight, without a single tremor. The rune took shape on the paper perfectly. Minju finished the rune. She set down the quill. She looked at the drawing, then at her hands and their copper thimbles, then at Ethan. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything. She just stood there and cried, silently. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't try to comfort her. He just turned back to the table and went back to work. He gave her time. A minute later, Minju wiped her eyes. She said she needed to go practice. She picked up the quill. She picked up the paper. She left. At the door, she turned around. She bowed, deeply, in the Eastern custom, and she left. Julian Ashford hadn't forgotten about him. A week after the exams, Ethan received a note, an official letterhead bearing the Ashford coat of arms. An invitation to a duel, an academic one, a legal one. According to Valamore's rules, a student could challenge another student to an academic duel. The loser had to fulfill one demand made by the winner. Refusing the duel meant automatically conceding defeat. Julian's demand was stated in the note. If Ethan lost, he would leave the academy of his own accord. Ethan read the note twice. The duel was a magical one. 2 mages would enter the arena and battle with spells. Ethan had no magic. He had so little mana in his body that he couldn't even light a candle from a distance. Julian knew this. That was precisely why he had challenged him. Ethan had to either refuse and be humiliated, or accept and lose, or find a third option. He found it in the rules, the old rules, which he'd read in the library last week. The rule for academic duels stated that the challenged party had the right to choose the form of the contest, not the challenger. The challenged party. A magical duel was the default format, but not the only one. Ethan wrote his reply. I accept the challenge. Format of the contest, an alchemical duel. The task is to be determined by a neutral judge. The winner is the one whose potion is better. He sent the note back and waited. The day of the duel. The Academy's great hall was packed. Stone bleachers rose in a semicircle around the central arena. 2 tables, 2 cauldrons, 2 sets of ingredients. Professor Tarek stood between the tables, a tall, lean man with a military bearing and short-cropped gray hair. He taught combat magic and regarded alchemy as something of secondary importance, the perfect neutral judge. He was on neither Ethan's nor Julian's side. He didn't care either way. The hall was buzzing. Students filled the stands to the last seat. The faculty sat in the front row. Halbrand was among them. His face was expressionless, but Ethan noticed that he was sitting upright and not looking away. Minju was sitting in the 3rd row. Aiden was next to her. They weren't talking, but both were looking at Ethan. At the far end of the stands, Ethan spotted a head of red hair. Saoirse Ashford, Julian's cousin. She was sitting alone, apart from the group of Ashford students. That struck him as odd. Julian stepped onto the stage first, an expensive robe, a silver clasp. Behind him, a servant carried a leather case with his personal tools, a golden mortar, a silver pestle, crystal vials. Ethan stepped out second, a gray robe, a canvas bag in his hands. Inside were his glassware from Grammar, measuring flasks, a funnel, a charcoal filter, and a small bottle of alcohol, just in case. Tariq announced the rules. The task would be determined by drawing lots. Both participants would receive the same ingredients. Time limit, 1 hour. The result would be evaluated based on 3 criteria: effectiveness, purity, and safety. The winner is the one whose potion scores higher overall. Tariq drew the lot. A medium healing potion, 2nd level of difficulty, standard recipe. Ethan knew it. He'd read about it in the library a week ago. It's more complicated than minor restoration. It requires more ingredients. It requires 3 stages of preparation. And most importantly, it requires magical activation in the final stage. A mage must infuse mana into the finished mixture to activate its healing properties. Without mana, the potion remains nothing more than a decoction. Julian had a strong reserve. Ethan had nothing. Julian knew this. He smiled. Tarek handed out the ingredients. Identical sets: silverweed root, blue link, moon moss powder, a shard of a mana crystal, mountain yarrow leaves, water. Ethan laid out the ingredients on the table. He looked at them. He thought. He had a plan. Not perfect, risky, but his only option. He couldn't activate the potion with mana, so he needed another way. Alcohol. Mana dissolves in alcohol. If he dissolved the shard of mana crystal in alcohol and added the solution to the potion, the mana would distribute evenly throughout the entire volume without any external activation. The crystal itself would become the source, in theory. He hadn't tested this on a mid-level potion, only on a minor restoration potion, but the principle should work. It has to. Tarek gave the signal. The clock was ticking. Julian worked quickly and confidently. He knew the recipe. He chopped the roots. He ground the powder. His movements were precise and well-rehearsed. He'd done this hundreds of times. Ethan worked differently. First, he rinsed the root in acidified water. The room buzzed with whispers. That wasn't in the recipe. Tarek raised an eyebrow but didn't stop him. The rules didn't prohibit additional processing. They only prohibited magical intervention until the final stage. Ethan sliced the root into thin strips. He laid them out on the table. While the root was drying, he turned his attention to the mana crystal. He took a small piece and placed it in a small flask. He added alcohol from a bottle. The crumb began to melt slowly. A bluish light pulsed in the liquid. Several students in the front row stood up. They had never seen a mana crystal dissolved before. They were always ground into powder. Halbrand leaned forward. His eyes were wide open. Julian wasn't looking at Ethan. He was focused on his cauldron. His potion was brewing according to the recipe. Murky, brown, standard. In the final stage, he would place his hands on the cauldron and pour in mana. The potion would activate. It would turn greenish, functional, not brilliant, but effective. That would be enough to defeat a mana cripple, or so he thought. Ethan added the ingredients to the cauldron. Slow heating, no boiling. He stirred with a glass rod. He timed it. At the 20-minute mark, he added lotus essence. It usually clashed with the root, but the root had been washed. The tannins were removed. The conflict disappeared. The potion remained stable. At the 30-minute mark, he filtered the brew through a charcoal filter. The murky liquid became clear, light green, clear. Tariq rose from his seat and came closer. At the 40-minute mark, Ethan added moon moss powder. The potion thickened. The color deepened. Emerald. Ethan checked the temperature. He dipped his finger into the water at the bottom of the cauldron. Warm, not hot. Good. At the 50-minute mark, he took out a flask containing a dissolved crystal, an alcohol solution of mana, bluish, shimmering. He added it to the potion. The entire hall fell silent. The potion flared up. Not brightly, gently, like dawn. The emerald color turned golden green. The light came from within. The potion glowed, without magical activation, without an infusion of mana, all on its own. Ethan poured it into a glass vial. He set it on the table. The golden green liquid pulsed softly with light inside the clear glass. The hall was silent. Julian finished 5 minutes later. His potion was standard. He placed his hands on the cauldron. His palms glowed. Mana flowed into the mixture. The potion turned a murky green. Work potion. He poured it into a crystal vial and set it on the table. He looked at Ethan's vial. His face twitched. Tariq approached both tables. He picked up Julian's vial. He sniffed it. He nodded. Standard. He picked up Ethan's vial. Sniffed it. Froze. Held it up to the light. Watched the pulsating glow. Turned to Halbrand. Halbrand nodded. Tariq opened Ethan's vial. He cut his forearm, deeper than usual for a test. He dripped a single drop of the potion. Just one. The cut closed up in 10 seconds. Tariq looked at his hand, then at Ethan. Then he opened Julian's vial. He made the same cut on his other arm. He poured out half the vial. The cut took 30 seconds to heal. Tariq placed both vials on the table. He announced the result. In terms of effectiveness, Crow's potion outperforms Ashford's by a factor of 5. In terms of purity, Crow's potion is clear and stable. Ashford's potion is cloudy and contains sediment. In terms of safety, Crow's potion contains no sedative impurities. Ashford's potion contains a standard level of side components. The winner, Ethan Crow. Silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the hall erupted, not with applause, with noise, arguments, shouts, disbelief, delight, outrage, all at once. Julian stood at his desk. His face was pale. He had lost to a scholarship student, a mana cripple, in public, in front of the entire academy. His hands clenched into fists. He turned and walked out of the hall, without saying a word. Ethan stood at his desk. Minju was smiling. Aiden looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Halbrand rose from his seat and left the hall. Quickly, Tariq approached Ethan. He said he'd never seen anything like it. He asked how the potion had been activated without an infusion of mana. Ethan replied briefly. He'd dissolved the crystal in alcohol. The mana had distributed evenly. The activation had occurred from within. Tariq paused. He said this needed to be discussed with the faculty council. Then he left. Ethan gathered his things, the flasks, the funnel, the filter, and packed them into his bag. He headed for the exit. Saoirse Ashford was waiting for him at the door. Red hair, green eyes, a griffin clasp on her robe. She stood with her arms crossed, looking up at him. She was half a head shorter than him. She said he'd just humiliated her family in front of the entire academy. Ethan replied that he hadn't been the one to challenge him to a duel. Saoirse narrowed her eyes. Then she suddenly smirked. She said that Julian was an idiot, and that he deserved it. Then her expression turned serious. She said that now he would be in trouble, real trouble. The Ashfords do not forgive humiliations. Julian would go to his father. His father would go to the rector. The rector would listen because the Ashfords pay for the academy's upkeep. Ethan asked why she was telling him this. Saoirse paused. She said she hated injustice, even when the injustice comes from her own family. Especially then. She left. Ethan watched her go. Then he went to his room. That evening, Halbrand arrived, without knocking. He entered the room. He closed the door. His expression was somber. He said that Ethan had demonstrated an alcohol-based mana solution in front of the entire academy, in front of the faculty, in front of students from noble houses who would write letters home. In a week, the guild would find out. Ethan said he knew. Halbrand said the plan for a quiet publication no longer worked. They'd drawn too much attention too quickly. Ethan said he'd had no choice. If he'd lost the duel, he would have had to leave the academy. Halbrand sat down in a chair. He rubbed his face with his hands. He said he understood. But now they needed a new strategy. Defense. The guild arrived 12 days later, sooner than Halbrand had expected. Ethan found out that morning when Minju ran into his lab, her face pale. She said there was a carriage bearing the Alchemist Guild crest standing at the academy gates. Black wood, a golden mortar on the door, 2 guards in uniform robes, and the man who stepped out of the carriage, gray-haired, upright. In a white robe without a single stain, Magister Valen Crest, the guild's supreme inquisitor. Ethan knew that name. Halbrand had mentioned it twice. Both times, the professor's voice had grown quieter. Crest wasn't an executioner. He was worse. He was a politician, a man who quietly destroyed careers, through legal clauses, through procedures, through accusations that were impossible to refute, because they were phrased in such a way that any response sounded like an excuse. Ethan got dressed. He took the book from under the mattress. He hid it in a secret compartment behind a stone in the lab wall. He'd prepared the compartment a week ago, just in case. That in case had arrived. Crest entered the academy like a master. Rector Vern greeted him personally. They'd known each other for a long time. Crest was a frequent guest at Valemore. He oversaw compliance with the dogma of pure formulas in all the academies. That was his position, his authority, his tool. The dogma stated that ancient recipes were sacred and immutable. Any deviation from a recipe was considered heresy. The punishment for heresy was determined by the Inquisitor. It ranged from a fine to the revocation of the right to practice alchemy. In severe cases, it could lead to the loss of mana. Crest convened a meeting in the council's great hall. Present were Rector Vern, professors from all faculties, Halbrand, Tarek, and the deans of the faculties. Aiden was among them. Itana was summoned as the accused. He entered the hall and saw Cross for the first time. A gaunt face, icy gray eyes, thin lips, hands folded in his lap. Not a single superfluous movement. He looked at Ethan as an entomologist might look at a beetle, with professional interest, devoid of emotion. Crest began gently. He said he'd heard amazing things about the young scholarship recipient from Valemore. He said it had piqued his interest, not alarmed him, piqued his interest. He asked Ethan to describe his methods. Ethan described them: rinsing, filtration, temperature control. Crest listened. He nodded. Then he asked about the alcohol solution of mana. How did Ethan know that the crystal dissolves in alcohol? Ethan replied that he had tested it experimentally. Crest asked why. Why try something not described in the recipes? Ethan said he wanted to understand how the crystal worked. Crest smiled, subtly, coldly. He said that understanding wasn't part of a student's duties. A student must study, repeat, perfect their technique. Understanding comes with experience, over decades, not through the experiments of a 17-year-old boy. Halbrand tried to intervene. Crest raised his hand, not rudely, politely, but Halbrand fell silent. Crest continued. He said that the problem wasn't with the result. The result was excellent. The problem was with the method. The method implies that ancient recipes are imperfect, that they can be improved, and that undermines the very foundation upon which the entire science of alchemy rests. If a single student can improve a 300-year-old formula, then the formula was flawed. If the formula was flawed, then the masters who created it were wrong. If the masters were wrong, then the entire system of knowledge is unreliable, and that is chaos. Crest spoke calmly, logically, and convincingly. Ethan listened and realized that he was facing a dangerous man, not because he was evil, but because he sincerely believed what he was saying. Or he was such a good actor that it made no difference. Ethan asked to speak. Crest nodded. Ethan stood up. He looked out at the hall, at the professors, at the rector, at Aiden in the row of student leaders. He said one thing. He said that his methods were reproducible. Any alchemist could repeat what he was doing. Wash the root, filter the decoction, control the temperature. This requires no talent, no mana reserve, no noble lineage. All it takes are hands and a head. He offered proof, right then and there. Let any student in the hall replicate his method under his guidance. If the method works only for Ethan, then it's a personal gift, and there's no point in arguing. If the method works for anyone, then it's knowledge. And knowledge cannot be declared heresy, because knowledge belongs to everyone. The hall was silent. Cross looked at him for a long time. Then he said he accepted the proposal. He chose the student himself, Julian Ashford. The hall began to whisper. Crest smiled. It was a calculated move. If Julian couldn't replicate Ethan's method, then the method only works for Ethan, a personal gift, possibly forbidden. If Julian could replicate it, that meant the mana cripple had just taught the Ashford heir a trick, and Julian would rather break the cauldron than admit he'd learned anything from a scholarship student. Ethan accepted the condition, not because he wanted to, because he couldn't refuse. They went down to the practice hall. 2 cauldrons, 1 set of ingredients divided in half. The task? A minor restoration potion. Simple, basic. Ethan stood next to Julian and began to explain. His voice was steady, emotionless. Step 1. Rinse the root in acidified water. Here's the vinegar, here's the water. The ratio is this. Julian looked at him with hatred, but he did it. Because the whole room was watching him. Because Cross was watching him. Because refusing would mean admitting he was incapable of repeating the simplest procedure. Step 2. Slice the root into thin strips. Increase the surface area. Julian sliced. Crookedly, roughly, but he sliced. Step 3. Heat slowly. Don't boil. Keep the temperature below the boiling point. Julian turned down the heat. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles on his cheekbones stood out. Step 4. Filter through charcoal. Ethan gave him his spare filter. Julian poured the decoction through it. The cloudy liquid became clear, golden. Julian paused. He looked at the result in his hands. He'd seen this during a duel, but it's one thing to see it, it's another to do it yourself. His hands held a vial of potion that was the best he'd brewed in 3 years of training, and he'd done it in 20 minutes, following the scholarship student's instructions. Tariq took both vials, Ethan's and Julian's. He checked them. The results were nearly identical. Ethan's potion was slightly purer, but the difference was minimal. The method worked. For both of them, Tariq announced the result. The hall buzzed. Crest remained silent. Ethan turned toward him. Their eyes met. Crest stood up. He walked over to Ethan. He stopped 2 steps away. He spoke quietly so that only the two of them could hear. He said that Ethan was talented. That was precisely why he would have to stop him. Knowledge that isn't controlled in the weapon in the hands of others. Ethan replied just as quietly. He said that knowledge that is controlled is not knowledge. It is a commodity. Crest tilted his head slightly. He acknowledged the blow. Then he turned and walked out of the hall. Rector Vern watched him go. Then he looked at Ethan. There was no approval in his eyes, only concern. Crest left that same day, but Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Halbrand arrived that evening. He said that Crest could not formally accuse Ethan of heresy. The method is reproducible. It's not a personal gift. It's not forbidden magic. Just a different way of processing the ingredients. But Crest would find another way. He always does. Ethan nodded. He asked what to do now. Halbrand said that now they would work. Faster, more, better. The more results there are, the harder it is to ignore them. The more people use the method, the harder it is to ban it. Ethan agreed. They started that very night. Halbrand brought ingredients from his personal collection, rare ones, expensive ones. He placed them on the table and said he'd been saving them for 20 years. For what? Something important. This is important enough. Ethan looked at the ingredients, then at the professor. He said thank you. Halbrand waved his hand, sat down in the corner, pulled out a new notebook, a blank one, and began to take notes, with childlike excitement in his eyes. Aiden arrived the next morning, uninvited. She stood in the doorway of the lab. She said she wanted to work with them, not as an observer, as a co-author. She brought her notes, 3 notebooks, 312 recipes, each one broken down by ingredients, with comments, with questions in the margins. She'd been keeping these notes for 3 years, not because anyone asked her to, because she couldn't help but keep them. Ethan looked at the notebooks, then at her. He said that this was exactly the kind of person he needed, someone with a perfect memory and discipline, someone who knows all the recipes by heart. Because to improve the system, you first have to know the system. He knows the principles, she knows the details. Together, they can do what's impossible apart. Aiden sat down at the table. She opened the first notebook, and they began. The next 2 months were the most productive of Ethan's life, in both of his lives. The lab in the utility room of the East Wing had turned into a real workstation. Grammer the glassblower received orders every week, measuring flasks, titration burettes, glass coils for distillation. The old man no longer asked why, he just did it, and with every order, his work became more precise. Ethan paid generously. Money flowed in from sales of clear water. Minju expanded the network. Now it wasn't just Valamore students buying the potion. Through merchants from the village, vials were making their way to the neighboring town. 3 silver coins apiece, cheaper than the standard clarity potion at the pharmacy, and 4 times more effective. Demand was growing. Ethan worked according to a schedule, lectures in the morning, lab work with Halbrand and Aiden in the afternoon, brewing commercial potions in the evening, the book at night. He deciphered it slowly. The language was dead, but the formulas were alive. Every page contained structural formulas, reactions, synthesis schemes, and that recurring symbol. Ethan counted it 117 times in the first 50 pages. It appeared in the formulas as a variable, as an unknown element, as part of the equations. Ethan began to suspect that the symbol represented mana, not metaphorically, literally, like a chemical element, with its own valence, with its own properties, with its own place in the system. Whoever wrote this book, he knew that mana was a substance, not energy, not a gift from the gods, a substance. Aiden became his right-hand woman. She worked 12 hours a day. Her memory was phenomenal. She remembered every recipe, every ingredient, every property. Ethan would specify the requirements. We need a buffer with a pH of 4, plant-based, compatible with blue lotus essence. Aiden would close her eyes for a second. Then she'd list 3 options, specifying where to get them and how much they cost. They'd created a system. Ethan came up with the ideas. Aiden checked them for compatibility with the entire knowledge base. Halbrand provided institutional cover and access to ingredients. Minju handled sales and finances. 4 people, 4 roles, 1 mechanism. In 2 months, they optimized 27 standard recipes. Each one became purer, more effective, safer. Halbrand kept a lab journal. Ethan insisted on the format: date, hypothesis, method, result, conclusion. The professor, in his 70s, learned to keep a lab journal like a freshman, and he was happy. At the end of the 2nd month of working together, Ethan created his first completely original formula, not an improvement on an existing recipe, a new potion. He called it 2nd generation clear water. The formula was more complex. Instead of 1 active ingredient, there were 3: marsh mint extract to neutralize side effects, an alcohol solution of a microdose of mana crystal to enhance the effect, and a new ingredient that no one had ever used before in concentration potions: mountain jasmine pollen. Ethan had found a mention of it in a book, on a page with a formula that resembled the structure of a nootropic. Mountain jasmine pollen grew in the mountains behind the academy. Minju gathered it in 2 days. Ethan purified it. He isolated the active component through distillation. He added it to the formula. The result exceeded expectations. The potion lasted 6 hours instead of 2, with no side effects. Concentration improved not by 30%, as with the standard potion, but by 70%. Aiden was the first to try it. She took a sip. 5 minutes later, she sat down at the table and in 2 hours wrote the term paper she'd been putting off for a month. Then she looked at Ethan. Her eyes were shining. She said it was impossible, that things like that don't happen. Ethan said they do, if you remove the impurities and add the right ingredient. That same night, something unexpected happened. Ethan was working in the lab, alone. It was past midnight. He was copying formulas from a book by the light of 3 candles. The door opened. Without a knock, Ethan turned around. Standing in the doorway was a girl, blonde, slender, big gray eyes, no older than 16. She was wearing a nightgown with a robe thrown over it. Not a student's robe, a robe bearing the academy's crest, with the rector's crest. Noelle Hartright, granddaughter of Rector Verne, a child prodigy, admitted at 13, a vast reserve of mana, and a reputation as a spoiled princess whom everyone fawns over. Ethan knew about her from the notebooks of the previous owner, and from Aiden's conversations. Noelle was the subject of gossip. Everyone knew who she was. No one knew what she was really like. She walked into the lab. She looked around at the shelves, the equipment, the journals, the flasks, the distillation apparatus. Then she looked at Ethan. She said she couldn't sleep. She said she'd been wandering the hallways and saw a light coming from under the door. She said she was bored. Ethan asked why she'd come here of all places. Noelle shrugged. She said the whole castle was asleep, but he wasn't, and she wondered why. Ethan said he was working. Noelle asked on what. Ethan showed her a flask containing a new potion. He explained what he was doing, briefly, without oversimplifying it, just as he would explain it to a colleague, not to a child. Noelle listened. Her expression changed. Her boredom faded, and genuine interest took its place. Vivid. She asked if she could help. Ethan looked at her. He thought for a moment. Then he pointed to the sink. He said she could, if she washed those 3 flasks. Noelle stared at him. No one in her life had ever asked her to wash dishes. No one had ever given her a boring task. Everyone had given her the best, the grand stuff, the showy stuff. She walked over to the sink, rolled up her sleeves, and began to wash, thoroughly, slowly, diligently. Ethan went back to work. They spent 2 hours in the lab, in silence. Noelle washed the flasks. Then she wiped down the table. Then she labeled the vials as he dictated. Her handwriting was beautiful and neat. When she left, it was almost 3 in the morning. She paused at the door. She asked if she could come back tomorrow. Ethan said yes. Noelle left. The next day she came, and the next, and the next. A week later, Noelle became his second assistant. She kept an observation log. She labeled samples. She washed the equipment. She prepared the ingredients. Boring, routine work, and she was beaming with happiness. For the first time in her life, no one was telling her she was special. For the first time, she was expected to produce results rather than just a smile. For the first time, she was valued for what she did, not for who her grandfather was. Aiden treated her with caution. The granddaughter of the rector in a scholarship student's lab, it was strange, dangerous, potentially problematic. Minju accepted her calmly, just as she accepted everything, quietly, without questions. Halbrand shook his head and said that Ethan gathered people around him, like a magnet gathers iron filings. Ethan said he was simply giving people work that suited them. Noelle brought an unexpected bonus. Her presence in the lab meant that Rector Vern knew about Ethan's work. He couldn't have not known. His granddaughter spent every evening in a back room in the East Wing, but Vern remained silent. He didn't approve, he didn't forbid it. The war reached the academy sooner than expected. Ethan learned about it from Rachel Down. She burst into his life abruptly, like a bullet into a wall. A squad of 12 soldiers arrived in Valamore at dawn. 4 cavalrymen, 6 infantrymen, 2 support mages. The commander, Lieutenant Rachel Down, 22 years old, dark-skinned, a scar across her left eyebrow, short, dark hair, eyes like 2 pieces of obsidian. She entered the rector's office and reported. Royal Intelligence had received intelligence. The cult of the Crimson Flame is advancing toward the academies. 2 border fortresses have already been destroyed. The 3rd is holding out, but not for long. Intelligence believes the cult's target is the mana sources in the academy's basements. Rachel's squad has been assigned to Valamore to guard the East Wing. The East Wing, the oldest, the vulnerable, the one where the scholarship students live, and where one of the deep mana sources lies beneath the foundation. Ethan saw Rachel in the hallway of the East Wing on his very first day. She was inspecting the rooms, checking the walls, the windows, the doors. She was assessing the defensive positions. Her movements were precise and economical, not a single superfluous gesture. She peeked into his lab. She saw the flasks, the equipment, the reagents. She asked what they were. Ethan explained. Rachel looked at the shelves with vials. She asked if there was anything among them that would be useful in combat, and Ethan said it depended on what she considered useful. Rachel said that anything that kills the enemy or prevents the enemy from killing you is useful. Ethan nodded. It was honest, simple, soldier-like. He said he could help. Rachel looked at him appraisingly. A skinny boy in a gray lab coat, the hands of a chemist, the eyes of an adult. She said she'd see, and she left. That evening, Minju told him what the whole academy already knew about Rachel Down. A year ago, she had commanded a squad of 30 people. They were guarding a caravan carrying mana crystals. The cult attacked at night. Their shields were breached, all of them. The magical barriers that were supposed to withstand any attack burst like soap bubbles. 29 people died. Rachel survived because she fell into the river. They found her 2 days later, 10 kilometers downstream, with 3 broken ribs and burns all over her body. She returned to duty 3 months later, but she wasn't fully back. Minju saw her at night. Rachel wasn't sleeping. She was sitting by the wall of the East Wing, staring into the darkness. Every night, Ethan began working on a combat lineup. He'd been thinking about it for a long time, ever since he learned about the cult. If the cult can disable magical shields, that means they have a substance or method that neutralizes the mana in the barriers. If they can neutralize it, then it's possible to create a counter-substance, a substance that protects mana from neutralization or restores it after an attack. He began with an analysis. He asked Rachel to describe what had happened to the shields. Rachel came into the lab. She sat down in the chair. She spoke briefly, without emotion. The shields glowed blue, then they turned red, then they burst. Before they burst, they were covered with something resembling rust, reddish-brown spots on the surface of the barrier. Rachel remembered the smell, bitter, metallic, like old blood. Ethan took notes. Reddish-brown spots. A bitter metallic smell. Oxidation. The cult was oxidizing the mana in the shields. It was turning active mana into inert mana, like rust on iron. Iron doesn't disappear. It loses its properties. The same goes for mana. It doesn't fade away. It oxidizes. Ethan jotted it down in his journal. Hypothesis. The cult is using a mana oxidizer. Countermeasure. An antioxidant for mana. A substance that prevents oxidation, or restores oxidized mana. He worked for 2 weeks. At night, Aiden helped with finding the ingredients. Noelle helped with the tests. Her enormous mana reserve was ideal for experiments. She created small magical barriers. Ethan tried different formulations, attempting to mimic the cult's attack. He didn't know the exact formula for their weapon, but he knew the principle, oxidation. And if mana is a substance with chemical properties, then it obeys the laws of chemistry. An oxidizing agent can be neutralized by a reducing agent. He found the solution on the 11th day, an alcohol tincture of silverweed root, purified, concentrated, with added ice moss extract. He called it the Veil Dissolver. Veil was what the soldiers called the reddish-brown coating on their shields before they burst. Ethan applied the dissolver to Noelle's barrier. Then he doused the barrier with the strongest oxidizing agent he could find, a sulfuric acid solution. primitive, crude, but the principle was the same. The barrier became covered with red spots. Then the spots began to fade. The dissolver was working. Noelle looked at her barrier. It had held. For the first time in all her tests, something had protected the magical shield from a chemical attack. She turned to Ethan. There was a smile on her face. The first real smile he'd ever seen on her dot. Ethan came to Rachel with the results. She was sitting by the wall of the east wing. Night, 3 o'clock. Ethan sat down beside her. He didn't mention her insomnia. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He handed her a vial. He said it was an antidote against whatever had killed her squad. He explained how it worked. Rachel took the vial. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at Ethan. She asked how he knew what had killed them. Ethan said she'd told him herself. She'd described the symptoms. He'd analyzed them. He'd found the antidote. Rachel was silent for a long time. Then she asked why he was doing this. Ethan answered simply, because he can. Rachel clenched the vial in her fist. Her jaw tensed. She didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry. But her eyes glistened in the moonlight. She said she'd check the ingredients on the next patrol. Ethan nodded. He stood up. He walked back to the lab. Behind his back, Rachel quietly said thank you. So quietly that he almost didn't hear her dot. 3 days later, Rachel's patrol encountered a cult reconnaissance unit, 5 heretics, in red hooded robes. They emerged from the forest at dawn. They were heading toward the academy walls. Rachel intercepted them at the edge of the woods. The fight was brief. The heretics struck first. A red mist burst from their hands. A veil. The magical shields of Rachel's soldiers began to be covered with brown spots. Rachel smashed Ethan's vial against her shield. The golden liquid spread across the barrier. The spots disappeared. The shield glowed, brighter than before. The heretics froze. Their weapons didn't work. For the first time, Rachel didn't give them a chance to recover. 30 seconds of battle. 3 heretics killed. 2 fled. Not a single soldier lost. Rachel returned to the academy with trophies, the cult's robes, amulets, and a small vial containing a thick red liquid, their oxidizer. Rachel placed the vial on Ethan's desk. She told him the squad was intact. Everyone was alive, thanks to him. Ethan picked up the vial. He opened it. He sniffed it. Bitterness, metal, old blood, exactly as Rachel had described. Now he had a sample of the enemy's weapon. He could analyze it, break it down into its components, understand its mechanism, and create a defense not just for one battle, for all of them. News of the skirmish with the cult spread throughout the academy within a day, but not the whole story. The official version was simple. A patrol had encountered scouts and repelled the attack. Only those in the know were aware of the veil dissolver, Rachel, Ethan, and his team, and Rachel insisted on secrecy. She said that Royal Intelligence tracks any information about methods of fighting the cult. If they found out that a scholarship student had created a counterformula, they'd take him away. They wouldn't ask. They'd take him. They'd lock him in a basement, and he'd be brewing for the rest of his life. No right to leave, no right to refuse. Ethan appreciated the warning. Rachel was protecting him, not on orders, by her own choice. That was new and important. But secrecy had an expiration date. A week after the skirmish, Leah Solomon arrived at the academy, a visiting exchange student from the Kingdom of Corven, the daughter of the business magnate Solomon. 20 years old, chestnut hair, bright hazel eyes, a loud laugh. She filled any room she entered with her presence. She spoke 5 languages. She knew the prices of everything. She knew people in all 3 kingdoms, and she had a nose for money. She'd heard about Clearwater through her business contacts, a student-made potion from Valemore that was better and cheaper than the one sold in pharmacies. She came to check it out, and she found Ethan. Their first meeting took place in the dining hall. Leah sat down next to him without being invited. She introduced herself. She asked 40 questions in 10 minutes. Production volume, cost of goods sold, distribution channels, margin, logistics. Ethan answered. With every answer, Leah's eyes lit up brighter. She said he was sitting on a gold mine and didn't even know it. She said that his sales network through Minju was like a kid's lemonade stand, that he needed a system, distribution, standardization, quality control, a brand. Ethan listened. She was right. Minju sold the product herself, hand to hand. That worked for 50 vials a month, but not for 500, and certainly not for 5,000. Leah proposed a partnership. She would take care of everything outside the lab, sales, negotiations with pharmacies, contracts, and logistics. She knows the trade routes. She knows the people. She knows how to get around the guild's monopoly. Because the guild's monopoly is based on the fact that only the guild knows how to brew high-quality potions. If an alternative appears on the market, the guild loses its leverage, and Leah really wanted the guild to lose its leverage. Ethan asked why. Leah paused, hesitated. Then she said, "Her father pays the guild a third of his profits for the right to sell alchemical goods. Every merchant in the 3 kingdoms pays the guild for a license, for certification, for the right to use their seal on the goods. Without the guild's seal, no pharmacy will accept a potion. This isn't science, it's racketeering." Leah smiled, but her smile was forced. Ethan thought about it. Then he agreed. The terms were simple. Leah gets 20% of sales. All decisions regarding the formula remain with Ethan. Minju stays on the team. Leah nodded. She said that Minju would be given a position, academic sales coordinator. From that day on, Ethan had a commercial director. Leah worked quickly. Within 2 weeks, she had signed contracts with 3 pharmacies in the nearest town, unofficial ones, without the guild's seal. The potions were sold as herbal tinctures. Technically, they weren't medicines, not potions, just tinctures. The guild didn't regulate the tincture market, a loophole in their own rules. Leah found it in 2 days. Sales increased 6-fold. Ethan had to ramp up production. He began training Minju and Noelle in the basic procedures: rinsing, filtration, temperature control. They learned quickly. Minju was meticulous and patient. Noelle was quick and precise. Within a week, they could brew standard potions without his assistance. Ethan freed up time for research. He returned to the book, armed with new knowledge. His analysis of the cult's weapons had given him the key. The red substance in their composition was a derivative of that very formula with the repeating symbol. Ethan was now certain. The symbol signifies mana. Mana is a chemical element, or a compound, with specific properties, with a specific structure. And the book describes its synthesis, not extraction from natural sources. Synthesis, the artificial creation of mana. He turned the pages, slowly, carefully. The old parchment crumbled beneath his fingers. On page 73, he found a diagram, a large one, spanning the entire spread. The diagram illustrated the process, a long chain of reactions. Inputs, minerals from the depths of the earth. Output, mana, crystalline, pure. Next to the diagram were numbers. Ethan couldn't read the text, but the numbers were universal. Volumes, temperatures, time. Someone, 300 years ago, was producing mana, not extracting it from sources, producing it as a product. And that meant that mana in the world wasn't natural. It was artificial, created by an ancient civilization. And if they stopped producing it 300 years ago, that meant the reserves were running out. That's why magic was growing weaker. It wasn't that the students were lazy. The fuel was running out. Ethan closed the book. He lay down on the bed. He stared at the ceiling. The world around him was built on lies. Mages considered mana a gift from the gods. The church taught that mana was eternal and unchanging. Rector Vern accused the students of laziness. But the truth was simple and terrifying. 300 years ago, someone had destroyed those who knew how to produce mana, declared them heretics, erased their knowledge, and appropriated the remaining reserves. Control over mana is control over the world. And that control was not meant to fall into the wrong hands. The cult of the Crimmingham Flame, the descendants of those who were destroyed. They are not heretics. They are the last ones who remember the truth, and they want to reclaim what was taken from them. Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't know who was right. The cult kills people. That's a fact. The guild controls knowledge for the sake of power. That's also a fact. The kingdoms are building their power on a resource that is running out. That's also a fact. And he's a scholarship student in a gray robe, with a book under his mattress, with a team of 6 people, and with the realization that the world is careening toward the abyss. He called Halbrand. At night, he told him everything about the book, about the formulas, about the symbol of mana, about the synthesis diagram, about the connection to the cult. Halbrand listened in silence. When Ethan finished, the professor sat motionless for a long time. Then he said one word, unthinkable. Then he stood up. He walked over to the window. He looked out at the academy at night. He said that if this were true, then everything he knew about the world was wrong. Everything he had taught for 30 years. A lie. Not his lie, but a lie he had repeated. His voice was quiet, old. Ethan said that it wasn't his fault, that what mattered wasn't who had lied. What mattered was what to do next. Halbrand turned to him. There was pain in his eyes and determination. He said that from now on, they would keep working, decipher the book, find a way to synthesize mana, and save the world, which doesn't deserve it, but they had no other world. The assault began without warning. It was 3 in the morning. Ethan hadn't been sleeping. He was sitting in the lab, working on deciphering the last part of the synthesis diagram. Rachel was sitting next to him. She came every night. She wasn't sleeping. She sat by the wall, sharpening her swords. Sometimes they talked. More often, they were silent. Ethan liked that silence. Rachel did too. He was brewing. She sat beside him. Two people who couldn't sleep had found each other at 3 in the morning in the basement of the old academy. Ethan was preparing a special potion for her. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands by evening, slowed reactions after 3 days without sleep. Rachel's body was breaking down from chronic sleep deprivation, but regular sleeping pills didn't work for her. A soldier who sleeps too soundly is a dead soldier. Ethan created a concoction he privately called Silent Night, not a sleeping pill, a restorative, a potion that gave the body the effect of 4 hours of deep sleep in 40 minutes of light dosing, without any loss of reaction time, without a foggy head. Rachel took her first dose 3 days ago. She slept for 40 minutes. She woke up, and for the first time in a year, her hands weren't shaking in the morning. She didn't say anything. She just looked at her hands, then at Ethan. She nodded. That was enough. An explosion struck the east wall. The walls shook. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The candles went out. Rachel was on her feet before Ethan had a chance to get up. 2 swords in her hands. Her eyes were wide open. Her trained body didn't think. It acted. She said one word, cult, and she rushed toward the door. Ethan grabbed the bag that was sitting under the table, ready, packed a week ago. Inside were 20 vials of Veil Dissolver, 10 vials of Restoration Potion, 5 packets of blinding powder, 3 bottles of smoke mixture, and an emergency brewing kit. He ran out into the hallway. The East Wing was in chaos. Scholarship students were fleeing their rooms. Screams. A crash. A second explosion struck closer. A section of the wall collapsed. Figures in red robes began crawling through the breach. Rachel met the first 3 at the breach. 2 swords worked like scissors, fast, precise, deadly. The first heretic fell with his shoulder sliced open. The second took a blade to the stomach. The third stepped back and raised his hands. A red mist, a haze. Rachel's shield began to be covered with brown spots. Ethan tossed her a vial. Rachel caught it without looking. She smashed it against her shield. The spots vanished. The shield flared. Rachel stepped forward. The third heretic didn't have time to realize what had happened. Ethan ran down the hallway, toward Minju's lab, toward the fellows' rooms. He needed to assemble a team. He found Minju in the second-floor hallway. She was in a nightgown, barefoot, but she was holding a box of vials. Her supply of injectable potions. She was prepared. Not today, a long time ago. Ever since Rachel had told them about the cult, every evening Minju would fill the syringes and put them in the box by her bed, just in case. That just in case had arrived. Noelle came running a minute later. Her eyes were ablaze. Mana pulsed around her hands, a golden glow. Her reserves were immense. In battle, she could maintain a shield strong enough for 10 people, or strike hard enough to shatter a wall. But she was a 16-year-old girl who had never seen a real battle. Her hands were shaking, not from tremors, but from fear. Ethan placed his hand on her shoulder and told her she didn't need to fight. She just needed to hold the shield over the lab. That was all. Noelle nodded. The trembling subsided. She had a specific task, not abstract terror, a concrete task. Her hands and her mind. Aiden was the last to appear, fully dressed, composed, her hair in a tight bun. She hadn't come from her room, from the faculty wing. She'd spent the night in Halbrandt's lab working on the next series of optimized recipes. She brought a supply of ingredients and 3 batches of potions already prepared. Ethan surveyed his team. Minju with the injections, Noelle with the shield, Aiden with the supplies, Rachel at the breach. One person was missing, Leah. Minju said that Leah had gone down to the basements. She said she would bring the younger students out through a secret passage, one she'd found last week while studying the building's blueprints to assess the storage areas. Leah had stumbled upon the secret passage by accident. She'd been looking for a basement to store supplies. Instead, she'd found a way to save 30 students. That Ethan turned the lab into an operations center. Noelle stood at the entrance. She raised her shield. A golden barrier blocked the doorway. Aiden sat down at the table. She began brewing the Veil Dissolver according to Ethan's instructions. Meanwhile, Ethan was working on something else, the final formula, the one he'd been preparing for the past week. Silence. A substance that absorbs mana within a 30-meter radius. A magical field neutralizer. All magic, both his own and others. He didn't want to use it. It was a weapon of last resort. It would strip everyone of their magic. Noelle would lose her shield. The cult's mages would lose their spells. Only steel would remain, and their heads, and their hands. He brewed, quickly, precisely. Every movement had been perfected over weeks of preparation, rinsing, filtering, 3 reagents in precise proportions, an alcohol solution of concentrated mana, and the cult's oxidizer, their own weapon, turned against everyone, including its creator. Saoirse Ashford appeared 20 minutes after the assault began. She had broken through the burning third-floor corridor. Her robe was smoldering. Her hair was singed, but a fire blazed in her hands. A real one, a magical one, her element. She entered the lab. She looked at Ethan, at Noelle, at Aiden. She said the West Wing was holding. The professors had set up barriers, but the East Wing was under heavier attack. That's where the main assault was. That's where the mana source was, in the basement. The cult was heading for it. Ethan asked how many there were. Saoirse said at least 50, maybe more. They're swarming over the wall like ants. Ethan nodded. 50 against Rachel's 12 soldiers and 6 students. The odds weren't good. He looked at the vial of silence. Almost ready. 10 more minutes, Dot. Rachel gave them those 10 minutes. She stood by the breach in the wall, with 2 swords. Her 2 support mages held a shield behind her. 6 infantrymen fought in the corridors. The heretics were pressing forward. Red mist filled the passageways. Rachel used the dissolver, vial after vial. The shields held, but the dissolver was running out. Minju worked non-stop. Wounded soldiers crawled toward the lab. She injected them with a recovery potion, an injection, precise dosage, fast-acting. One soldier was seriously wounded. A deep gash in his side. Blood was flowing rapidly. Minju put on her thimbles. Her hands grew steady. She drew a healing rune directly onto his skin, around the wound. The rune glowed. The bleeding stopped. The wound began to close. The soldier opened his eyes. He looked at her. Minju was covered in his blood. Her hands were in thimbles. Her eyes were focused. She wasn't trembling. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trembling when it really mattered. Ethan finished the silence spell, a clear liquid in a glass vial. It had no smell. It weighed nothing. A small vial capable of neutralizing all magic within 30 meters. He picked it up. He looked at the team. He said that when he threw the vial, they'd have 2 minutes without magic. Noelle would lose her shield. Saoirse would lose her fire. The support mages would lose their barriers. But the cult would also lose its veil and its spells. 2 minutes. Just steel and wits. Saoirse nodded. She said she was ready for it. Minju nodded silently. Noelle smirked. She said this was finally something interesting. Rachel stood by the door. She said one word. Throw. Aiden stood up from the table. She took a knife from the ingredient rack. Not a sword, a kitchen knife. But in her hands, it looked like more than enough. Ethan approached the breach. Below, in the courtyard, heretics were crowding together. Red robes, red mist. They were preparing a massive assault. Ethan took a swing and threw it. Dot. The vial shattered against the courtyard stones. A wave passed silently, invisible, but felt by every cell in the body. The mana vanished. All of it. All at once. Noelle's shield went dark. Saoirse's fire went out. The mage's barriers burst, and the cult's red mist dissolved into the air. Silence. Real. Absolute. The world became ordinary, without magic, without radiance, without power. The heretics froze. They had grown accustomed to their veil, to spells, to magic. Without it, they were just people in red robes, with daggers and bewildered faces. Rachel didn't give them a second. She leaped into the breach. 2 swords, a soldier's body that remembered every strike. She didn't need magic. She had never relied on it. Saoirse followed, without fire, but with a sword she'd wrenched from the hands of a dead heretic. She was the daughter of a warrior clan. She'd been taught to fight before she'd been taught to cast spells. 6 of Rachel's soldiers charged out of the corridors, without shields, without barriers, steel against steel. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. It was enough. When the mana returned, when the air was once again filled with the tingle of energy, when Noelle raised her shield and Saoirse ignited fire in her palms, the battle was already over. The East Wing had held. 23 heretics killed. The rest fled. Defenders' losses? 4 wounded. Not a single casualty. Minju sat on the floor amid empty syringes and vials, covered in blood, someone else's. She had stabilized all 4 of them. She'd pulled one back from the brink of death. Morning. Dawn. The eastern wall was smoldering. The breach in the wall was 3 meters wide. The courtyard was littered with debris and bodies. Rector Vern arrived at dawn, old, upright, with a cane. He stood in the ruined courtyard and looked around. Then his gaze settled on Ethan. Ethan was standing at the entrance to the lab. Behind him sat his team, on the steps, exhausted, alive, together. The rector approached. He was silent for a long time. Then he said one sentence.
Establish your department and name it whatever you want.
Ethan turned to his team. Minju, Saoirse, Aiden, Noelle, Rachel. Leah was coming up from the basement, 30 underclassmen behind her, all safe. Ethan said, "The Department of Applied Alchemy. Our motto? We brew for a specific person." Noelle laughed. Saoirse rolled her eyes but smiled. Rachel nodded. Minju started to cry. Quiet, from exhaustion and happiness. Aiden took out a notebook and wrote down the name, in neat handwriting. On the first page of the new journal, the Department of Applied Alchemy was assigned 3 rooms in the East Wing. Rector Vern signed the order the day after the assault. 3 rooms, former storage rooms, stone walls, low ceilings, no windows. But Ethan looked at them and saw the future. The first room became the main laboratory, the second a storage room for ingredients, the third a classroom. Grammar received the largest order of his life, 40 pieces of glassware, measuring flasks, burettes, retorts, condensers, funnels, glass tubes of all diameters. The old man worked for 2 weeks straight, and for the first time in 30 years, he smiled in his sleep. Ethan set up a fume hood. A real one. A copper box above the workbench. A pipe led through the wall to the outside. The draft was created by the temperature difference. Primitive, but it worked. Vapors no longer accumulated in the room. He hung the rules on the wall. First, label every vial. Second, store hazardous reagents in a separate cabinet. Third, no incense in the lab. Fourth, a lab coat and gloves are mandatory. Noelle read the rules. She asked what FL stood for. Ethan explained. Flammable liquids. Noelle said that was boring. Ethan said that a boring death from a vapor explosion was even more boring. Noelle put on her lab coat. The first students arrived a week later, not by order, of their own accord. 7 of them. 4 scholarship students from the East Wing, 2 students from the Faculty of Healing, and 1 freshman from a noble family who had watched the battle from his window and decided he wanted to be useful. Ethan met them in the classroom. Chairs, a blackboard, chalk. He said he wouldn't teach them recipes. He would teach them to think, to observe, to take notes, to repeat, to verify. He said the first assignment was simple. Rinse a silverweed root in 3 different solutions and record the differences. The students exchanged glances. They had been expecting secrets and revelations. Instead, they were given the task of washing roots. But by the end of the day, each of them saw that the washed root produced a different color of decoction, a different smell, a different consistency. They saw the difference with their own eyes, and they asked why. Ethan smiled. For the first time in months, they had started asking why. That was the beginning that Halbrand taught the theory classes. He had restructured his course. Instead of having them memorize recipes, he began explaining the principles. What happens to an ingredient when heated? Why some substances dissolve in water and others do not? How impurities affect the result? He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. For 30 years, he had repeated dogma. Now he was learning anew, alongside his students, and his eyes burned as they had never burned before. Aiden had become a senior lecturer. She had developed the curriculum. She had systematized all 27 optimized recipes. She had created instructional cards. Every recipe, every step. Every explanation of why. Her handwriting was perfect. Her cards were works of art. Ethan told her so. She blushed. For the first time in his memory, she turned away. Then she turned back and said that the cards weren't science. Science was their joint work on new formulas. Ethan agreed. They worked together every evening. They sat at the same table, shoulder to shoulder. They discussed the results. They argued about dosages. Aiden was stubborn. So was Ethan. Their arguments lasted for hours. And they ended with a compromise that turned out to be better than either of their original ideas. Once, after a 3-hour argument about the concentration of the buffer solution, Aiden fell silent mid-sentence. She looked at him, then she leaned in and kissed him, briefly, precisely, just like everything else she did. Then she pulled away, picked up the pipette, and went back to work, as if nothing had happened. Ethan stood there with his mouth open. Then he closed it. Then he went back to work too. Noelle walked into the lab a minute later. She looked at them. She narrowed her eyes. She said the lab smelled strange, not like chemicals. Ethan said it was a new reagent. Noelle said she wasn't stupid, and she left, slamming the door. Leah had built up a distribution network in 2 months. Clearwater was sold in 12 pharmacies across 3 cities. Under a brand name Leah had come up with herself, Valamore Department. A simple label, the name, ingredients, dosage, expiration date. No one had ever put an expiration date on potions before. Leah insisted. Ethan approved. It set their product apart. Revenue grew. Ethan reinvested everything back into the lab. New equipment. Rare ingredients. Scholarships for the department's students. Leah handled the bookkeeping. Every copper coin accounted for. Every expense documented. She was happy. For the first time in her life, the money she counted was hers, not her father's, not her husband's. Hers, earned by her own wits. She wrote her father a long letter about the department, about her work, about how she'd found her calling. Between the lines lay something else, that she wouldn't marry a stranger, that the engagement was off, that for the first time she had her own standing in this world. Her father didn't reply. Not yet. Rachel trained her soldiers in a new way. Ethan supplied her squad with a full set of equipment, veil dissolver for everyone, healing potions, stimulants with no side effects, smoke bombs, blinding powder. Rachel devised tactics that didn't rely on magic. Her soldiers learned to fight without shields, without barriers, just in case the mana disappeared again, like that night. She came to Ethan every evening, not just at night, now in the evening too. She would sit by the wall. Sometimes she would talk about her squad, about those she'd lost, about how the body remembers every dead person. Ethan didn't comfort her. He didn't offer advice. He just brewed beside her, quietly, methodically. The sound of boiling water, the clink of glass flasks, the scratch of a pen on paper. These sounds soothed Rachel better than any words could. One night she said that his lab was the only place where she could breathe. Ethan said nothing, but he moved a second chair closer to her spot by the wall down. The guild struck back 3 months after the department was founded. Not with swords, not with magic, with paper. Master Valen Crest filed a formal complaint with the Council of Academies. 12 counts. Violation of the dogma of pure recipes. Unauthorized modification of approved formulas. Sale of uncertified potions. Undermining the authority of the guild. Use of unidentified methods for processing ingredients. And 7 more counts, each of which was worded so that any defense would sound like an admission of guilt. Crest knew his business. The charges were directed not only against Ethan, but also against Halbrand as his supervisor, and against Rector Vern as the official who had authorized the establishment of the department. Crest was striking at the entire chain of command. If Ethan fell, he would drag the professor and the rector down with him. This made a defense nearly impossible. No one would want to risk their career for the sake of a scholarship. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later in the capital. The Council of Academies met once every 6 months. Representatives from all 7 academies, representatives from the guild, representatives from the crown, the church, the army, the full complement. Crest brought 12 witnesses, guildmasters, apothecaries whose businesses had suffered from competition from Clearwater, professors from other academies who considered Ethan's methods a dangerous precedent. Ethan was preparing. 2 weeks without sleep. He gathered evidence, results of the experiments, observation logs, comparative analyses. Aiden organized the data, 200 pages, every experiment described, every result confirmed by replication, every improvement documented. Halbrand prepared the theoretical justification. Leah hired a lawyer, an old wheeler-dealer from the capital who knew the council's procedures by heart. They arrived in the capital the day before the hearing. It was Ethan's first time leaving the academy since the transfer, the capital of the Kingdom of Aurelian, a city of white stone, towers, bridges, canals, magical lanterns at every intersection, beautiful, opulent, and built on a resource that was running out. Ethan looked at the magical lanterns and wondered how much mana was spent every night to light a single city, and how much was left. The council was in session in the White Chamber, a vast, domed hall, marble columns, benches rising in an amphitheater. On the dais stood the chairs of the council members, 7 rectors, the head of the guild, a representative of the crown, the archbishop of the Church of the Primordial Light, 10 people who would decide his fate. Cross spoke first, for an hour, methodically, calmly. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He explained. He said that dogma exists not to restrict, but to protect. The recipes have been tested over centuries. Every ingredient, every step, every proportion. They are safe because they are unchanging. If every student were allowed to alter the recipes as they saw fit, the consequences would be catastrophic. Mistakes, poisonings, deaths. Who would bear the responsibility? A scholarship recipient with no backup plan, or a system that has worked for 300 years? The audience listened. They nodded. Cross was convincing. He wasn't lying. He was telling part of the truth, the part that worked in his favor. Ethan spoke second. He stood up. He looked out at the audience, at the rectors, at Cross, at the man in the robe bearing the crown crest. He didn't argue with Cross. He didn't try to prove that Cross was wrong. Instead, he did what he did best. He demonstrated. He asked permission to conduct a demonstration. The council agreed. Ethan took 2 vials out of his bag. Standard restoration potion. Cloudy, brown. Bought at a pharmacy in the capital that morning, with the guild seal, and his own potion. Golden, clear. He offered any member of the council the chance to test both. Silence. Then a representative of the crown stood up. General Mordock, an old soldier with 3 medals on his chest. He made a cut on his forearm. He drank the standard potion. The cut healed in 4 minutes. The general noted the bitterness and the onset of drowsiness. Then he made a second cut on his other arm. He applied a drop of Ethan's potion. The cut healed in 10 seconds, without bitterness, no drowsiness. The general looked at his hands, then at Ethan, then at Crest. He asked one thing. Why, in 300 years, had no one done this before? Crest turned pale, but he didn't back down. He said that the result didn't justify the method, that the process was what mattered, that safety is more important than effectiveness. Ethan replied. He said that his potion was safer, no drowsiness, no bitterness from tannins, no residue that could cause an allergic reaction. He suggested a test. Let the council appoint an independent commission. Let the commission test both potions on a group of volunteers. A blind test, without knowing which potion is which, and let the results decide. Not dogma, not tradition. Results. The council deliberated for an hour. Cross objected. General Murdoch insisted. The army needs potions. Good potions. If a kid from a provincial academy makes them 5 times better than the guild, the army wants to know how. Rector verned the entire process, but when it came time to vote, he raised his hand in favor of an independent commission. The decision was made. 6 votes to 4. The commission will be appointed. The charges have been suspended pending its conclusion. Crest left the hall without looking back. His back was straight. His stride was steady, but Ethan saw the knuckles of his clenched fists turn white. That evening at the hotel, Noelle approached Ethan. She was in the capital with them. She'd come without her grandfather's permission. She simply got into a carriage and set off. She said she'd seen something during the hearing. As Crest was leaving the courtroom, a man approached him. A man in a dark robe without a coat of arms. They exchanged a few words. Noelle didn't hear what was said, but she saw Crest's face. It had changed. It went from cold to alarmed. The man in the dark robe left quickly. He disappeared into the crowd. Noelle described him. Tall, thin, hooded, red gloves. Ethan stopped. Red gloves. The cult of the Crimson Flame. Crest was talking to a member of the cult, the Supreme Inquisitor of the Alchemist Guild, and heretics whom the guild officially considered its chief enemies. They were talking, quietly, quickly. This sounds familiar. Ethan jotted it down in his log. Cross and the cult. A connection. What kind? Why? Need to investigate. Ethan returned to the academy with 2 tasks. First, prepare materials for the independent commission. Second, to figure out the connection between the cross and the cult. The second task was more important and more dangerous. He told Rachel. She listened. Her expression didn't change. She said that Royal Intelligence had long suspected an information leak. The cult always knew where to strike. When? How? As if someone were passing them information from the inside. But they suspected army officers. Not the guild. The guild was above suspicion, too influential, too close to the crown. Rachel said that if Ethan was right and the cross was connected to the cult, then this wasn't just treason. It was a systemic conspiracy. The guild controls mana. The cult wants to regain control over mana production. If they're working together, they're sharing power. The guild sells it. The cult protects the monopoly from anyone who might find an alternative. Ethan recalled Cross's words, knowledge that isn't controlled in the weapon in the hands of others. Now those words sounded different. Cross wasn't feared that knowledge would fall into the wrong hands. He feared that it would slip from his own grasp, because his hands and the cult's hands are one and the same. Did Ethan return to the book with a new understanding? He reread the final pages, the ones he had previously been unable to decipher. Now the pieces were falling into place. 300 years ago, there was a scientific school in Aurelian. They synthesized mana from deep-seated minerals. Mana was a product, accessible, cheap, and abundant. Mages weren't born with a reserve of it. They obtained it, like medicine. Any peasant could become a mage if they received a dose of synthesized mana. This put everyone on an equal footing: the nobility, the commoners, the strong, the weak. Those in power did not like this. The war was short, the school was destroyed, the scholars were executed, the books were burned, almost all of them. The victors took the remaining reserves of mana and declared them a gift from the gods. They built the church, they created the guild, they founded the academies, and they wrote the dogma. The formulas are sacred, mana is divine, questions are forbidden. It worked for 300 years, but mana reserves aren't infinite, they're running dry. Magic is weakening, reserves are dwindling, and those at the top know the truth. They know that mana is running out. They know that they must either find a way to produce it again or maintain a monopoly on what remains. The Cross chose the latter. The cult wanted the first option, but the cult's methods were war and bloodshed. They remembered the formulas, but they had forgotten precision. Their concoctions were crude. Their weapons worked, but they maimed their own as well. They knew what to do, but they'd forgotten how. Ethan knew how. He had a book, he had knowledge, he had a laboratory, and he understood that the world was on the brink of dot. He gathered a team, everyone, in the lab, at night. He locked the door and told them everything. Everything he knew about the book, about mana as a resource, about the ancient school, about the destruction, about the cult as the descendants of scientists, about the cross and its connection to the cult, about how mana is running out. The room was silent. Halbrand sat with his eyes closed. His face was ashen. Aiden held a pen but wasn't writing. For the first time, Minju pressed her hands to her chest. Noelle stared at the wall. Her grandfather had built his career on a lie, not his own, but a lie he had defended. Rachel stood by the door, motionless, like a statue. Saoirse was clenching her fists. Leah was calculating something in her head, most likely the market value of mana if it became known that it was finite. Ethan gave them time, a minute, 2, 3. Then he asked what they wanted to do. Rachel answered first. She said she wanted the truth. For those who had died. For her squad. They had died defending a system that had lied to their faces. Saoirse answered second. She said she wanted justice. For everyone whom the Ashfords and their ilk considered inferior by birthright. If mana isn't a gift from the gods, but a product, then there are no chosen ones and no unchosen ones. There are only people. Minju answered third, quietly. She said she wanted every sick person to be able to get medicine, not just the Duke, peasants too. Aiden was the fourth to speak. She said she wanted to know the truth, the whole truth, to the very end, and to record it so that no one could ever erase it again. Noelle answered last. She said she wanted to talk to her grandfather. Leah remained silent. Then she said one thing. How much money do we need? Ethan smiled, for the first time in a long time. They worked for a month. Ethan deciphered the mana synthesis diagram. The formula was complex, 12 stages. AG required a level of precision this world had never seen. Temperatures down to tenths of a degree, proportions down to milligrams, timing down to seconds. In a world without thermometers, without precise scales, without stopwatches, Ethan built instruments. A thermometer made from a glass tube filled with mercury he extracted from cinnabar. Scales made from copper plates with counterweights, machined by Grammer according to his blueprints. An hourglass with calibrated holes for different time intervals. Each instrument was a revolution. Each instrument made the impossible possible. Aiden helped with the calculations. Noelle supplied mana for the experiments. Minju prepared biological samples. Rachel guarded the lab. Leah purchased minerals. Saoirse came every evening. She didn't help with chemistry. She didn't know how. But she brought food. She made sure Ethan got at least 4 hours of sleep. She scolded him when he forgot. Once, she dragged him out of the lab by the collar of his lab coat. He said he needed 1 more hour. She said he needed to sleep or she'd set his journal on fire. He looked at her. She wasn't joking. He went to sleep. At the door to his room, she stopped. She spoke softly. She said she used to hate being an Ashford. Now she hates it less. Because the name Ashford lets her stand by his side, and no one would dare touch her. Ethan said he didn't need her protection. Saoirse said she didn't care what he needed. She would protect him because she wanted to. Then she blushed, turned around, left, quickly. The synthesis succeeded on the 43rd day, deep into the night. Ethan stood in front of the copper apparatus they'd been building for 2 weeks. Noelle sat beside him. She was feeding mana into the reaction chamber, steadily, consistently. Her enormous reserve was ideal for this. Aiden monitored the temperature, her eyes fixed on the mercury thermometer, her voice steady. She called out the degrees. Ethan added the reagents, drop by drop, milligram by milligram. 12 stages, 6 hours of work. In the final stage, the solution in the flask began to glow, softly, bluish, a familiar light, the same light found in mana crystals. Ethan stared at the flask. It contained 20 milliliters of liquid, transparent, blue, shimmering, synthetic mana, the first in 300 years. Noelle reached for the flask. She froze. She looked at Ethan. He nodded. She touched the glass and pulled her hand away. She looked at her fingers. She looked up. She described what she felt. Mana. Real. Just like in the crystals. No. Purer. Brighter. Stronger. Aiden made a note in the logbook. Mana synthesis. Success. Date. Time. Volume. 20 milliliters. Her hand was trembling. For the first time since Ethan had known her. In the morning, he showed the results to Halbrand. The professor held the flask as if it were a child, carefully, gently. His eyes were wet. He said that in his entire life he never thought he'd see something like this. Then he set the flask on the table. He straightened up and said that now they were in real danger. 20 milliliters of synthetic mana. If the guild finds out about this, if the cult finds out about this, if the crown finds out about this, they'll kill for this flask without hesitation, because whoever can produce mana rules the world. Ethan knew this. He had been preparing, but not for what actually happened. Crest returned 3 days later, not alone. With him was a detachment of 20 guild mages in ceremonial robes, and 30 soldiers of the Royal Guard, and a document bearing the crown's seal, a search warrant for the Department of Applied Alchemy. The grounds, suspicion of producing prohibited substances. Someone had snitched, one of the students, or one of the apothecaries, or one of the servants. It didn't matter. Kreutz knew. Rector Vern couldn't defy a warrant bearing the royal seal. He stood in the hallway and watched as the guards entered the east wing. Noelle stood next to her grandfather. She took his hand for the first time in many years. Vern looked at his granddaughter. His face twitched. Ethan was waiting for them in the lab. It was quiet. The desk was clean. The book was hidden in a secret compartment behind a stone. The flask of synthetic mana was hidden separately, in a place only Rachel knew about. She had taken it that night, carried it outside the academy walls, hid it in the forest, in the hollow of an old oak tree, which she had marked with a notch, a soldier's method, reliable. Cross entered the lab. He looked around. Shelves with reagents, equipment, lab logs. Everything was neat. Everything was labeled. Everything was in its place. He looked at Ethan. He said he'd received information that forbidden experiments were being conducted here. Ethan asked what kind. Kreutz said the synthesis of unknown substances using mana crystals. Ethan replied that the use of mana crystals was permitted for students under a professor's supervision. Halbrand is his supervisor. All experiments are documented. The logs are on the table. Crest took the logs. He flipped through them. He read them. There were records of experiments, real ones, but they had been edited. Aiden had rewritten the key pages overnight. She'd removed all mentions of mana synthesis and replaced them with experiments on optimizing standard potions. Her handwriting was flawless. Even when compared to the original, it was impossible to spot the difference. Crest found nothing. The search lasted 4 hours. The guards turned over every stone, every cabinet, every shelf. Empty, clean, nothing forbidden. Crest stood in the center of the lab. His face was impassive, but his eyes betrayed his fury. Quiet, controlled, dangerous. He approached Ethan, close. He spoke softly. He said he knew. He couldn't prove it, but he knew, and that this wasn't the end. Ethan looked him in the eyes. He replied just as quietly. He said he knew too, about the cult, about the red gloves, about the conversation in the council corridor. Cross froze. For the first time, his mask wavered. Ethan saw fear for a single second. Then the mask returned. Cross turned and left. The guards followed him. The guild mages followed them. Noelle came to Ethan that evening. She said she'd spoken with Grandpa. She'd told him everything, about mana, about the book, about synthesis, about Cross and the cult. Vern listened in silence. Then he sat alone in his office for a long time. Then he called Noelle back and said he needed to think it over, but that he wouldn't stand on the sidelines anymore. Ethan nodded. Rector Vern was old, conservative, stubborn, but he wasn't a coward, and he wasn't a traitor. When the truth stood face to face with him, he didn't look away. That was more than Ethan had expected. The Council of Academies reconvened a month later, but this time, it wasn't at the Cross's initiative. It was at Rector Vern's initiative. The old man wrote letters to all 6 rectors personally. He sealed each one with his own seal. He sent them by courier. The content was identical. 3 lines. Mana is finite. I have proof. Come. 5 of the 6 arrived. The 6th sent a deputy. General Murdoch arrived on behalf of the crown, without an invitation. He had learned of the extraordinary meeting through his own channels, and showed up with a detachment of 50 guardsmen, not for a search, for protection. After that first hearing, the general launched his own investigation, and he found the same thing Noel did: the cross and the cult, a connection, an old one, systemic, money, information, mutual favors. Murdoch brought documents, intercepted letters, financial records, names. The meeting took place in the Grand Hall of the Valemore Academy, not in the capital, Vern insisted. On his territory, under his protection, Rachel and her squad controlled all the entrances. Circe stood by the main doors. Fire flickered in her palms. Not for show. For business, Crest arrived. He had no choice but to come. Absence from an extraordinary council meeting would have been an admission of guilt. He entered the hall, a white robe, icy eyes, a straight back. But Ethan saw it. Beneath the robe, beneath the mask, tension. Crest knew that something had changed. He didn't know exactly what. That Vern spoke first. He stood before the council, old, with a staff. His voice was quiet but firm. He said that for 30 years he had been the rector of Valemore Academy. For 30 years he had taught students to follow dogma. For 30 years he had believed that mana was a gift from the gods, and that the decline of magic was the fault of lazy students. He had been wrong. The hall fell silent. The rector of the academy, third in prestige, first in conservatism. He says he was wrong. Vern continued. He said that mana is not a gift. Mana is a product created by humans 300 years ago, and that the reserves of this product are running out. That's why magic is weakening. That's why reserves are dwindling. Not laziness, not sin, resource depletion. The hall erupted in whispers. Cross stood up. He demanded proof. His voice was calm, but his hands were clenched. That Ethan walked over to the central table. He set down a flask, blue liquid, shimmering, alive. He said it was synthetic mana, created in a laboratory, using formulas from a book that was 300 years old, a book written by scientists who were killed for that knowledge. He suggested they test it. Noelle stepped forward. She reached out toward the flask. She touched it. Her eyes widened. She turned to the room and said that the mana in the flask was real, purer than in any crystal she had ever held in her hands. The council was silent. General Murdoch stood up. He placed a folder on the table. Intercepted letters from the cross. Financial transfers from the guild to organizations linked to the cult. The names of intermediaries, dates, amounts. Cross turned pale. Then he pulled himself together. He tried to speak. He said it was a forgery, that the boy and the old man had colluded. Murdoch cut him off. He said the documents had been obtained by royal intelligence, under oath, with confirmation of authenticity. 3 independent experts. Cross fell silent. His mask held, but it was cracking. He scanned the room looking for allies. He found none. The rectors were staring at him, some with anger, some with disgust, some with pity. The head of the guild, an old fat man in a golden robe, moved away from the cross, physically, half a meter to the side. The cross saw this movement and realized he had lost foal. He could have left quietly, with dignity, but he didn't. He raised his hand. A vial slipped out of its sleeve, small, red, the very one, the cult's oxidizer. He threw it on the floor. A red mist burst out. The support mage's shields by the doors began to be covered with brown spots. The hall erupted in screams. Crest rushed toward the exit. Rachel intercepted him halfway there. One blow with the hilt of her sword to the jaw. Crest fell. Circe raised her hands. Fire burned away the red mist in 3 seconds. Ethan threw the veil dissolver at the shields. The spots vanished. The barriers were restored. 30 seconds from start to finish. Crest lay on the floor. Blood trickled from his split lip. His icy eyes had gone dark. Rachel stood over him. 2 swords, a calm expression. Murdoch approached. He looked at Crest. He nodded to the guards. They picked him up, bound his hands, led him away. The council met for another 3 hours. Without Cross. Ethan stood before them and told them everything. From the beginning, the book, the formulas, the ancient school, mana synthesis, depletion of reserves, the cult's connection to the murdered scientists. He hid nothing. Aiden stood beside him, handing out documents, charts, tables, experiment results. 200 pages, every page proof. Minju stood by the wall, silent, with thimbles on her fingers, ready to help if anyone felt ill at the news. No one did, but several rectors looked as if they had aged 10 years in an hour. The council's decisions were adopted unanimously. First, the Alchemist Guild loses its monopoly on potion certification. The market is open. Second, the dogma of pure recipes is repealed. Recipes are subject to optimization and verification. Third, the Institute of Applied Alchemy is established, based on Ethan Crow's department at Valamore Academy. It has the right to recruit students from all 7 academies. It has the right to conduct research. It has the right to publish. Fourth, Ethan Crow is appointed director of the institute with the title of Maitre. At 17 years old, the youngest Maitre in the history of Aurelian. Fifth, an investigation into the guild's activities and its ties to the cult of the Crimson Flame begins. Vern was the last to sign the documents. He affixed his seal. Then he called Ethan over. They stood by the window, the old rector and the young Maitre. Vern said he had been wrong his whole life, that he had defended a system that lied, that he had blamed the students for his own ignorance. Ethan said the lies weren't his fault. Vern shook his head. He said it wasn't his fault, but it wasn't anyone else's either. He could have asked why. He could have sought answers. He could have doubted. He didn't, because doubting was harder than believing. Ethan remained silent. Vern placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, a heavy, old hand, and said that now he had a chance to make things right. Not a lie. You can't fix a lie. The future. Ethan nodded. That evening, they sat on the steps of the East Wing. Everyone, Ethan, Minju, Saoirse, Aiden, Noelle, Rachel, Leah, Halbrand. The sunset bathed the academy's walls in gold. The wall of the East Wing still had a breach in it. They'd patched it with stones, roughly, temporarily, but the wall stood, just like they did. Minju sat next to Ethan, shoulder to shoulder, in silence. Her hands, clad in thimbles, rested on her lap, calm, steady. She had saved 4 people that night of the assault, and 12 more over the past few months in the academy infirmary. She was no longer afraid of being expelled. She no longer considered herself a burden. She was a healer, a real one. Saoirse sat 2 steps away. She was cleaning her sword. Her red hair fell across her face. She no longer wore the Ashford Griffin brooch. She'd taken it off after Julian left the academy. Quietly. No drama. His father had taken him away after his defeat in the duel. Saoirse stayed. Not like Ashford, like Saoirse. Aiden sat with a notebook. She was taking notes, even now. Ethan looked at her. He asked what she was writing. She said she was recording this moment, for history. He smiled. Noelle was lying on the steps. Her head rested on her bag. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't sleeping. She was just lying there. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to go anywhere. She didn't have to prove anything. She didn't have to smile at anyone. She could just lie there, and that was enough. Rachel stood a little to the side, out of habit. A soldier is always on the perimeter, but she was standing closer than before. Her hands weren't shaking. She'd slept the last 3 nights, 4 hours each night, without nightmares, thanks to Ethan's potion, thanks to the fact that there was someone nearby to whom she could say 3 words and who didn't pull away. Leah was sitting next to Hal Brandt. They were discussing the Institute's budget. Leah was citing figures. Hal Brandt nodded. He didn't understand half of what she was saying, but he trusted her, just as he trusted Ethan, just as he trusted this strange family that had gathered around the boy in the gray robe. That Ethan was watching the sunset. He was thinking about what lay ahead. The Institute, the first students, the curriculum, mana synthesis on an industrial scale. It would take years, decades. He thought about the cult, about those who remembered the truth, about those he would have to talk to, not fight, because they weren't enemies. They were the descendants of scientists, lost in their own pain, but they remembered. He thought about the book, about the one who wrote it, about that other scientist, 300 years ago, who knew the same things Ethan did, and who was killed for it. Ethan won't let that happen again. Not because he's stronger, but because he's not alone. Halbrand stood up. He stretched. His old bones creaked. He looked at Ethan. He said it was time to go to the lab. A new formula won't optimize itself. Ethan stood up. He brushed off his robe, gray and worn. He'd never changed into the master's robe. He didn't want to. That robe was his. Minju stood up next. Then Aiden. Then Noelle reluctantly got up from the steps. Saoirse sheathed her sword. Rachel stepped closer. Leah closed her notebook full of numbers. They went to the lab, together, just as they did every evening, just as they would tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a year from now. Ethan led the way, not because he was in charge, but because he knew the way. The light was on in the lab. Flasks stood on the table. A blank page awaited in the journal. On the shelf stood a flask containing a blue liquid, 20 milliliters of synthetic mana, the beginning of a new world. Ethan sat down at the table. He opened the journal. He picked up a pen, and he wrote the first line on the blank page. Institute of Applied Alchemy, Day 1. Behind him, his team took their places, each in their own spot. Minju by the cabinet with the syringes, Aiden at the second table with the index cards, Noelle at the sink with the flasks, Rachel by the door, Saoirse by the window. Leah was in the corner with an account book. Halbrand was in a chair with a magazine. Ethan looked up. He looked at them, at each one. Then he went back to work. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They knew. He wasn't brewing just any potion. He was brewing potions for them, for each one, for a specific person, with a specific pain, with a specific dream, and that was the only magic that would never run out.